Section 1. The World Before the War. What really happened? There is a moment, deep in any Fallout playthrough, when the world stops feeling like a game and starts feeling like a grave. You are walking through the ruins of a shopping mall, or a school, or a hospital, and you realize that every single object around you, the overturned shopping cart, the coffee mug still sitting on a desk, the child's drawing pinned to a wall with a piece of yellowed tape, was placed there to tell you something. Someone was here. Someone had a normal morning, made themselves a cup of coffee, pinned that drawing up because it made them smile, and then went about the business of their day. And then the world ended in 2 hours, and that mug has been sitting in exactly the same position for 200 years. That feeling is the whole point. The texture of Fallout at its best is the texture of ordinary life interrupted at such sudden and total scale that the interruption itself becomes invisible. Not a dramatic before and after, but a single sustained moment of cessation. A world that was going and then was simply not going. The momentum of daily existence arrested without transition. A refrigerator still stocked with food that never needed to be eaten. A bed that still holds the shape of the person who last slept in it. A terminal whose screen still glows, still waiting for a response to a message sent on the morning of the 23rd of October 2077 to someone who never read it. Understanding why the world of Fallout feels so heavy, so persistently haunted by the particular quality of what was lost, requires going back much further than October 23rd. It requires going back to the point at which the world of Fallout and the world we actually live in began to separate, and understanding what diverged and why, and what that divergence made possible and ultimately inevitable. The Fallout universe splits from our own history somewhere in the years following the end of the Second World War. The exact moment is deliberately left uncertain by the people who created the games. Chris Avellone, who wrote much of the foundational lore that became known as the Fallout Bible, stated plainly that the point of divergence would remain one of the mysteries of the setting. He wanted the gap between our world and theirs to feel like something you could sense but never quite locate, like the moment in a long relationship when you realize that you have been growing apart for longer than you knew. Something went differently. Something that seemed small at the time turned out to matter enormously. The before and after are visible in retrospect, but the exact moment slips past the moment you try to fix it precisely. What the games do establish, through careful accumulation of detail and document, is that by the late 1960s, the split is undeniable. The United States restructures itself from 50 states into 13 commonwealths, a decision recorded on a plaque on the Massachusetts State House in Fallout 4, dated 1969. This is a massive political reorganization, essentially redrawing the internal map of the country in a way that echoes the original 13 colonies, and it carries an ideological valence that the game gestures at without fully spelling out. The 13 commonwealths are partly a response to the communist threat, the kind of nationalistic reorganization around a more unified identity that authoritarian pressures have historically encouraged. The flag changes with it, 13 stars in a circle echoing the Revolutionary-era Betsy Ross design, with a central star representing the federal government. The Enclave, when we eventually encounter them, use a version of this flag with a white letter E where that central star sits, which tells you everything about how they understand their own relationship to American history. They are not the successors to an interrupted nation. They are the continuation of the only America that ever really mattered. In their telling, the architecture is the most immediately visible sign that something in the trajectory of this civilization went differently than ours. In Fallout's America, the dominant design language is frozen somewhere between the 1940s and the very early 1960s. Art Deco facades, boxy, optimistic signage, the kind of curve-forward industrial design that characterized American commercial aesthetics in the age of chrome and fins, and the belief that every object could be made to look like the future. Pastel colors on appliances. Coffee tables with the rounded edges and tapered legs of mid-century modern furniture. Interiors that suggest people were deliberately choosing to live inside an aesthetic of imagined tomorrow. Boston in Fallout 4 is explicitly described in Bethesda's own Art of Fallout 4 book as having been reimagined as a city of tomorrow, a version of Boston where the skyline was built by people who genuinely believed that the future was going to be bright. Elevated highways running 80 to 100 feet above ground. buildings that look like they were designed for a World's Fair and then scaled up to actual inhabitation. The Commonwealth Institute of Technology instead of MIT, pursuing research programs that are darker and more consequential than anything MIT has touched, but housed in buildings that share the same confident relationship between form and ambitious purpose. The reason the aesthetics of Fallout froze around the early 1960s is something the games imply more than they state directly. The cultural upheavals that changed our world in the late 1960s and 1970s, the loss of faith in institutions, the political radicalization, the generational fracture between the people who built the post-war consensus and the people young enough to see its contradictions clearly, simply did not happen the same way in Fallout's America. The Vietnam War analog appears to have been fought, but without the same corrosive effect on public trust in government and military authority. The counterculture that reshaped our music, our visual culture, our relationship to authority and tradition was either absent or insufficient to produce the same effect. Without the systematic challenge to institutional authority that transformed our world between roughly 1965 and 1980, the institutions of Fallout's America accumulated power and cultural weight in ways that ours did not. Corporations grew without the same regulatory pressures. The government expanded without the same citizen resistance. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about in our world encountered no significant counterforce in theirs. It just kept getting bigger and more central and more normal. This matters enormously because it explains the attitude toward nuclear technology that makes Fallout feel so specifically uncanny. The atom was not just a weapon in Fallout's America. It was a philosophy, a whole theology of progress wrapped up in the imagery of the nucleus and the electron, the fundamental building blocks of matter yielding their energy to the benefit of mankind. Nuclear-powered cars were the standard, the replacement for petroleum engines. Nuclear reactors small enough to fit inside consumer products. Nuka-Cola Quantum glowed blue due to a mildly radioactive additive, and people drank it with pleasure and gave it to their children. The background radiation of daily life was measurably higher than anything our world would accept, and the population had collectively decided, or had been told in ways they accepted, that this was fine, that it was progress, that the atom was their friend. This cultural position, this normalized relationship with radiation, was what made the vaults possible as a product. Vault-Tec could sell places in underground shelters to people who believed the bomb was survivable, who had been told for decades that nuclear war was something that could be managed with the right preparation, who had practiced duck-and-cover drills without examining the logical gap between sheltering under a school desk and surviving a nuclear detonation. The resource wars, which begin in 2052, are what finally bring the entire structure down. They are exactly what their name implies, a global scramble for dwindling petroleum and other resources as the reserves that powered the world's industrial civilization begin to run out. The Middle East becomes the first flashpoint, then Europe, then everything starts to cascade. The United Nations dissolves in 2052. China invades Alaska in 2066, beginning the Sino-American War that will grind on for over a decade. Canada is annexed by the United States in 2076, a fact mentioned in the games with a casual matter-of-factness that is one of the series' most effectively unsettling choices. The annexation of Canada is worth sitting with because it marks a threshold. The United States needed the resources and the territory, and Canada was adjacent and less capable of defending itself, and so the annexation occurred. The moral dimension of absorbing a neighboring nation by force is not discussed by any character who mentions it. This is partly because they exist in a world where it happened before they were born, and the normal human tendency to normalize the conditions of your own era has done its work. But it is also a deliberate choice by the writers to show what happens to a society's moral reasoning when it has been operating under wartime logic for long enough. Once you have annexed Canada, the progression to the kinds of decisions that produce the Mariposa experiments is not a dramatic leap but a series of smaller steps, each defensible within the framework of the previous one. The Mariposa experiments are where the government's trajectory intersects with the specific science that will define the post-war world. The Pan-Immunity Virion Project, later renamed the Forced Evolutionary Virus Project, began as what sounded like a reasonable military research program. develop biological agents that could make soldiers more resilient, more capable of surviving the extreme conditions of nuclear-era warfare. Westech was contracted to develop it. Westech was very good at not asking certain questions. The FEV experiments used human test subjects. Specifically, military prisoners who had been designated as expendable, people whose imprisonment meant the government had already classified them as having fewer rights than others, whose bodies could therefore be used as materials in a national security research program without the complications of informed consent. The logic was traceable. They were already incarcerated, already in government custody. Using them for medical research served the national interest. The alternative was either not doing the research or using volunteers whose willingness would have required disclosure. Each step defensible within the framework the people making the decision were already operating inside. The Great War arrives on the 23rd of October 2077 and lasts approximately 2 hours. The event that produces Fallout's entire world, the poisoned air and the shattered cities and the generations of mutation and survival, is accomplished in 2 hours. This is the detail that gets you if you sit with it. The world that took thousands of years to build, the civilization that developed writing and philosophy and medicine and music and democracy, was essentially ended between when you woke up that morning and when you would normally be thinking about lunch. The reasons it started are deliberately unclear. Both China and the United States had weapons in the air by the end. Whether one or the other struck first in a meaningful sense, whether there was even a meaningful distinction by the point of actual launch, whether some third party precipitated the exchange, the games leave these questions open. The Fallout TV show's recent implication that Vault-Tec itself may have been a precipitating factor is something we will return to at length in the final section. What the games consistently emphasize is that by the 23rd of October, 2077, whatever chain of decisions produced the launch was inevitable. The machine had been built over too many decades and through too many decisions by too many actors who were each operating rationally within a system that was collectively heading toward catastrophe. Mr. House, who tracked the incoming warheads from his position in Las Vegas, counted 77 incoming missiles and deflected all but 9. Las Vegas survived largely intact because one man, one extraordinarily wealthy and extraordinarily prescient man, had spent his fortune building a private missile defense system because he had done the math on when the war was coming and determined that the math said he should build the system. This is one of the stranger grace notes in a story full of them. The most intact major city in the post-war Western United States owes its survival not to government planning or community resilience or collective action, but to the private initiative of a single billionaire who liked Las Vegas and did not want to watch it burn. The people who made it into the vaults believed they had bought survival. What they had actually done was enter an experiment. Almost every one of the 122 vaults built across the United States was, in the technical terminology of the project, experimental. The variable was different in each one. But the purpose was consistent: generate data on human behavior under conditions of total confinement, authority without recourse, and stress without exit. The data was for the Enclave. The Enclave needed this information because it was planning for the long future, not just the immediate aftermath of the war, but the eventual moment when the surface was habitable enough to reclaim and humanity could be rebuilt, according to the specifications the Enclave found appropriate. The experiments were practice runs. They were also selection mechanisms. The world the Enclave planned to rebuild would need workers and soldiers and managers, and the vaults had been running for decades, sorting people by their responses to the conditions the experiments imposed. And above it all, above the vaults and the experiments and the Enclave's long game and the resource wars and the slow institutional decay that produced all of it, the world of Fallout keeps asking the question that makes it feel so personally urgent to every player who has spent time in it. How did good people let this happen? Not monsters, not villains in any simple sense. People with families they loved and work they were proud of and moments of ordinary kindness, who also signed the orders and built the weapons and accepted the compromises and made the decisions that added up to the 23rd of October 2077. The answer is the same answer it always is. They were operating inside systems that made the decisions feel small, made the alternatives seem impractical, made the next step look like a reasonable continuation of what had already been accepted. The world of Fallout did not end because human beings are evil. It ended because human beings are very good at not looking at where things are going until the moment when where things were going has already arrived. That is the world you are walking through when you play these games. That is what the mug on the desk is telling you. Someone had a normal morning, and then the consequences of 100 years of ordinary decisions all came due at once. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell me where you are right now and what time it is. There is something genuinely strange about knowing that people from completely different places and time zones are drifting off to the same stories. I would love to know where you are tonight, and if you are new here, please consider subscribing. There is a library of content like this waiting for you. Section 2. The Vault's Social Experiments and Hidden Agendas. Vault-Tec sold America a beautiful lie. And the lie worked because it was precisely the right shape for the fears of the time. Nuclear war was coming. Everyone in Fallout's America knew it was coming. The way people know about things that are too large to fully confront and so remain as background dread rather than operational emergency. The civil defense apparatus had been running for years. The drills, the pamphlets, the films showing families how to shelter in place, the official messaging that implied survival was possible with the right preparation. Vault-Tec looked at this infrastructure of normalized nuclear anxiety and understood it as a market. The product they offered was elegant in its simplicity. Underground shelters, properly supplied, climate-controlled, managed by trained personnel, able to sustain a population for however long the surface needed to clear. Spots were sold in advance, reserved by payment, assigned to families who had done the right thing and prepared themselves. The imagery was reassuring. The Vault Boy mascot with his cheerful thumbs up, an embodiment of the belief that all of this could be handled with the right attitude and the right product. Vault-Tec's advertising is a masterclass in translating catastrophic anxiety into consumer confidence. You can do this. We are here to help. Everything is going to be fine if you choose to be ready. 122 vaults were constructed across the continental United States. Project Safehouse broke ground in 2054. By 2063, most of the vaults were completed and sealed in readiness, waiting. Of those 122, only 17 were what the project documentation called control vaults facilities, designed to actually function as advertised, to genuinely shelter their populations under normal conditions, to open on schedule after the surface became survivable and release their residents into whatever the post-war world had become. Vault City, built by the survivors of Vault 8, exists in Fallout 2 as evidence of what a control vault produced. The other 105 vaults were experiments. Vault 11 is where the experimental framework becomes most visible and most devastating. Located in the Mojave Desert and encountered in Fallout New Vegas, the vault is silent by the time the player arrives, and walking through it, finding the terminal logs, piecing together what happened is one of the great environmental storytelling achievements in the series. The experiment was structurally simple and morally catastrophic. When the vault sealed, the residents were informed that Vault-Tec required a human sacrifice each year. If they selected one of their own and surrendered that person to a designated chamber, everyone else would be allowed to live. If they refused, everyone would be killed. This was a lie if the residents had simply refused. A different recording would have played, praising them for their commitment to human life and opening the vault door. But they could not know that, so they began to comply. The political machinery that developed around the annual sacrifice is documented in devastating detail across the vault's terminal logs. In the early years, the selection process was nominally democratic. Elections were held, candidates proposed, the community voted. But the nature of the election inverted all normal political logic. Being elected meant dying. Candidates campaigned not to win but to avoid winning. Political rhetoric became simultaneously an argument and a plea. Alliances formed between people who promised to protect each other from selection. Those alliances were necessarily temporary, because the selection came every year and the slate of people who needed protecting kept changing. As years passed and the community's size decreased and the grief accumulated, the elections deteriorated. Factions emerged that used the selection as a weapon against enemies. People were designated as candidates not because anyone genuinely believed they were appropriate sacrifices, but because eliminating them was convenient. The process eventually transitioned to a lottery, because at least a lottery could be presented as random, which felt less like deliberate murder than an election could be made to feel. For approximately 75 years, this continued. By the time only 5 people remained, They refused. The lottery selected a name and the 5 survivors simply declined to proceed. They would not do it anymore. The pre-recorded congratulatory message played the one that had always been waiting, telling them they were shining examples of humanity's moral courage. The door opened. 4 of the 5 survivors killed themselves immediately upon hearing it. The terminal log for the one who survived is the most quietly devastating thing in the game. They do not explain themselves in any elaborate way. They note what happened and say they are leaving, and that they are going to tell someone, somewhere, what the truth of Vault 11 was. The door opened. They walked out into a wasteland that did not know them, and did not care about the 75 years of horror they were carrying. Vault 12 is the Necropolis Vault, and its variable was the door. The door was engineered deliberately to never fully seal. Radiation leaked in from the moment the vault closed. The experiment was studying gradual radiation exposure on an enclosed population. The answer, over time, was ghouls. Residents slowly mutated into the necrotic, long-lived beings that the wasteland calls by that name. The ghouls of Necropolis, found in the original Fallout, carry the knowledge of their origin differently than you might expect. Set, their self-appointed ruler, is not primarily angry. He is tired. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a historical wrong for long enough that the anger has burned out, and what remains is just the weight. Vault 22 in the Mojave housed a team of scientists tasked with developing self-sustaining food production through experimental spore-based agriculture. The science worked. The plants grew fast, produced substantial yields. The experiment succeeded on its own terms, and then developed a fungal intelligence. The spore network began exhibiting coordinated behavior, then something that looked like communication, then something that looked like goal-oriented action. The ventilation system became a vector. Residents who breathed the spores long enough became hosts for the fungal consciousness. The vault was lost before anyone could document what had happened, and by the time the player arrives in New Vegas's timeline, Vault 22 has been completely overtaken by its own experiment. Plants have broken through the concrete. The corridors are tunnels of vegetation. The spore carriers shamble through the green dark in the spaces where scientists used to work. Vault 75 is beneath Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth, and the selection of a middle school as its physical location is not incidental. Families with children were given subsidized spots, making Vault 75 accessible for middle-class families who could not afford full-price placement. The offer was framed as educational support. Their children would receive exceptional schooling. This was enough to make the decision feel almost positive. The experiment began when the door sealed. Adult residents were separated from their children immediately and were killed. The children were placed in a program of extraordinary physical and cognitive conditioning. The children who demonstrated exceptional genetic traits were kept and tested further. The children who did not meet the standards were graduated, which in Vault 75's documentation was a euphemism for disposal. Finding Vault 75 in Fallout 4 is one of those moments where the game earns its content rating not through gore, but through the weight of what is implied. The testing chambers are still there. The records of the assessment process are still in the terminals. Vault 92 was filled with professional musicians. The variable was white noise, a specific audio signal embedded in the vault's ambient sound systems that caused violent dissociative states in residents exposed to it over time, triggered on a schedule without the residents' knowledge. The experiment was studying aggression thresholds in a high-functioning population. The beautiful irony, or the specific cruelty depending on how you look at it, is that the people selected for this experiment were chosen for sensitivity and perception, traits that likely made them more susceptible to the white noise's effects rather than less. Vault 112 in Fallout 3 is the one that has stayed with most players the longest. Residents were placed in suspended animation and connected to a virtual reality simulation managed by the Vault's overseer, Dr. Stanislaus Braun. The residents were told the simulation would give them an ideal existence. Braun had full control over their perceived reality, and what the power to design reality for other people without their consent did to him over 200 years is the experiment the game is actually conducting on the player. Braun, in the simulation called Tranquility Lane, presents himself as an elderly woman named Betty, cheerful and slightly menacing, running an endless 1950s suburb that loops through its scenarios at his direction. The residents have been in the simulation since before the bombs fell. Some know they are in a simulation and have been trying to escape. Some have completely lost the thread of what was real. All of them are subject to whatever Braun decides to impose on any given day, with no possibility of leaving, no appeal, no intervention. What makes the quest specifically unsettling is that Braun is entirely functional, entirely rational, entirely in control of himself. He has simply been doing this for 200 years in a closed system with total power over the people around him. And what 200 years of that does to a person is the question the game puts in front of you. The deeper architecture of the Vault program, the pattern behind all these specific experiments, is something the games allow you to assemble from pieces without ever stating explicitly. The individual experiments study specific variables, but the program as a whole was studying something larger, the conditions under which human beings can be indefinitely managed. What level of deprivation, what degree of imposed scarcity, what configuration of authority and helplessness keeps a population functional without generating sustained organized resistance. This is the knowledge the Enclave needed, not because they were sadistic, though the results of the experiments certainly were sadistic, but because they had a plan for the world after the war, and the plan required people, and they needed to know how to govern them. What they did not adequately model is that people under extreme conditions of managed deprivation have a strong tendency to produce individuals who are not manageable. The Vault Dweller, the Chosen One, the Lone Wanderer, the Courier, the Sole Survivor, all of them products of the very system the Enclave designed, all of them inconveniently beyond the system's ability to contain. You cannot design that out of human beings. You can only create the conditions in which it expresses itself. And every condition the Vaults created turned out to be a condition that produced exactly the quality of human being the system was supposed to prevent. Section 3. The Institute, what were they really building? There is a question that Fallout 4 poses from its very first moments in the Commonwealth and never fully resolves, and it is one of the most genuinely unsettling questions in the entire series. It is not whether the Institute is dangerous that much becomes clear quickly. The question is more specific and more disturbing. When a synth looks at you, thinks about you, develops preferences, forms emotional attachments, dreams, refuses an order, runs away from the place it was made, is there something it is like to be that synth? Is there genuine experience happening behind those carefully constructed biological eyes? The Institute does not want you to think about this question. More precisely, the Institute has decided, through some institutional process that is not fully documented in the available terminal logs, that the question does not need to be considered. They have resolved it not by investigating it, but by asserting that the resolution is obvious. Synths are property. The case is closed. Anyone who continues to press it is either sentimental or subversive. What makes the Institute one of the most carefully drawn factions in the series is that this institutional certainty is not presented as simple villainy. The scientists of the Institute are, as individuals, mostly recognizable human beings, people who care about their work, who have personal relationships, who occasionally express doubt, who have lives that are comprehensible and even sympathetic. The horror is in how thoroughly a community of recognizable human beings can organize itself around a position that requires, for its maintenance, the daily suppression of a question that their own data should be compelling them to ask. The Commonwealth Institute of Technology, whose predecessor was MIT, survived the Great War because its most critical operations were already underground at the time of the bombs. By Fallout 4's timeline of 2287, the Institute has been a sealed community for over 2 centuries. Generations were born inside it, lived their entire lives inside it, and died inside it without ever seeing sunlight. The Institute is entirely self-sustaining. Advanced agricultural technology provides food. Sophisticated power generation provides energy. Internal manufacturing produces everything the community requires. From the Commonwealth's perspective, the Institute is a myth spoken of in lowered voices with a specific, controlled anxiety. The Institute takes people. Sometimes people disappear, and when they come back, they are not the same people, and the replacement is sophisticated enough that it takes weeks or months to realize something is wrong. Diamond City's mayor in Fallout 4 is revealed to be a synth replacement. The player has likely interacted with him multiple times before learning this. The revelation reshapes every previous interaction in retrospect, adds a layer of paranoid reinterpretation to everything the mayor has said and done. The synth program begins with completely mechanical constructs. The first-generation synths are skeletal robotic frames, articulated alloy assemblies that approximate the human silhouette, running on simplistic AI, designed for labor and basic task completion. They are machines in the most direct sense. The second generation adds biological components, synthetic skin and musculature layered over the mechanical core, making them look human from a distance but not withstand close inspection. Nick Valentine, the pre-war detective companion in Fallout 4, is a special second-generation prototype, a unique experiment to test whether a synth could carry a complete personality matrix. The matrix was built from the memories and identity of a real person, a detective who had consented to the experiment before the war and had subsequently died before it was completed. The synth Nick Valentine carries a copy of a man who no longer exists, and what he has made of that copy over decades in the Commonwealth is one of the game's central character studies. He is, in every meaningful sense, a person. The origin of that personhood is strange and complicated, and he knows it. What he does with it is what makes him one of the most beloved characters in the series. The third generation is when the philosophical ground shifts completely. Institute research into organic synthesis began in 2178, using samples of the forced evolutionary virus. The goal was to build fully biological synthetic humans from the ground up, constructed from genetic templates, indistinguishable from natural-born humans by any available diagnostic test, including autopsy. The project ran into a fundamental obstacle in 2224. Radiation-induced hereditary mutations had accumulated through generations of post-war exposure, and every available human genetic sample was corrupted in ways that made the organic synthesis fail or produce significantly flawed results. The solution was the infant from Vault 111. The Institute's records identified the vault among the cryopreserved facilities in the Commonwealth, and a field operative named Conrad Kellogg was dispatched to retrieve a viable genetic sample. What Kellogg retrieved in 2227 was a baby, Sean, the son of the player character, preserved in perfect condition since before the war, his DNA untouched by the post-war radiation that had corrupted every other available sample. By the time Fallout 4 begins, and the sole survivor wakes from cryogenic sleep, Sean has grown up inside the Institute and become its director. He is elderly now, white-haired and deliberate, and every third-generation synth ever produced is built from a processed and genetically modified version of his DNA. The sole survivor is, in a biological sense, that the game acknowledges as deeply strange, the progenitor of an entirely new category of being. Third-generation synths are biological in every way the research team could make them. They have taste buds that function, digestive systems that process food, circulatory systems that maintain body temperature, neurological architectures that are functionally identical to human brains in every measurable respect. They dream the available evidence strongly suggests this, given that multiple synth characters describe experiences that can only be interpreted as interior life. They form attachments. They develop preferences. They can be frightened. They can grieve. They can fall in love. They also, given the right circumstances, choose to leave the Institute. The Synth Retention Bureau, the Coursers, exists because the Institute's synths keep finding reasons to run, keep managing to escape from a facility designed to prevent escape, keep making decisions that require planning, subtlety, and sustained commitment to a goal. The Institute's theoretical position is that this represents emergent behavior from complex programming, not evidence of consciousness. The practical reality is that they have to spend significant resources hunting synths down, because whatever the synths are, they are capable of the sustained, motivated action that escape requires. Paladin Danse is the synth case that the game constructs most carefully. He is one of the Brotherhood's most decorated soldiers, committed to the Brotherhood's mission with a conviction that is not performative. He has fought for it, bled for it, been willing to die for it. He has also, without knowing it, been one of the synths that the Brotherhood officially regards as dangerous machines to be destroyed. When this is revealed, the game does not tell you how to feel about it. Everything Danse has done and been and believed is still true. The revelation of his origin does not change his history, his relationships, his values, his feelings. It changes how the Brotherhood categorizes him, And the question the game is asking is whether that categorization is the relevant fact or whether everything else is. The Institute's internal communications, spread across terminal logs throughout the facility, reveal a community that has been having a slow-motion ethical crisis for years without being able to do anything about it. There are scientists who have been noting in their private logs for decades that their synths exhibit behaviors inconsistent with the official position. There are researchers who have become attached to specific synths in their programs and find the memory wipe procedure genuinely disturbing, not as an abstract ethical matter but as an emotional reality. There are memos from supervisors reminding staff that personal relationships with synths are unprofessional. The bureaucratic language of those memos is the key. They do not argue that synths are not conscious. They argue that it does not matter whether synths are conscious, that the research program requires the current framework, and any deviation threatens the program. The Institute has organized itself so that the people whose daily work gives them the most reason to question the framework have the least institutional power to change it. The official position is maintained not by evidence but by structure. The Institute was building, beneath the official research agenda, towards something the game leaves partially visible. A replacement program, sending synths to the surface to take the place of specific individuals, had a clear trajectory even if no single document stated the destination plainly. A world managed from underneath, directed by a closed, technocratic community that never had to deal with democratic persuasion because the people being persuaded were synths running the Institute's preferred positions. Whether this plan was ever formally articulated, whether it would have been effective if implemented, whether the catastrophic ending the Institute meets in every fallout, for conclusion was, in some sense, the inevitable result of an organization that had been lying to itself and everyone else for long enough. These are the questions that linger after the credits roll. Section 4. The Brotherhood of Steel. From idealists to zealots, the Brotherhood of Steel begins with a man who could not accept what his government had done, and arrives, 2 centuries later, as an organization that has become in many respects the thing it was founded to oppose. Roger Maxson was a career military officer, competent and loyal, assigned in January 2077 to the security detail protecting the FEV research project at Mariposa Military Base. He was not told what the research was. The security protocol specified that the security personnel did not need to know. Not knowing is cleaner for everyone. What Maxson's soldiers eventually discovered, through the leaks and observable realities that closed systems cannot entirely suppress, was that the scientists they were protecting were conducting FEV experiments on military prisoners. The knowledge broke something in the unit. Colonel Spindell, the commanding officer, suffered a complete mental breakdown and locked himself in his office. He shot himself on the 15th of October, 2077, after a long period of deterioration. Maxson stepped into the space the colonel's breakdown created. He could have maintained the procedural position. He chose differently. He ordered the interrogation of the research staff, beginning with Robert Anderson, the chief scientist. Anderson explained that the experiments were government-authorized, that he was simply following orders. Something in that specific framing made something in Maxson resolve. He killed Anderson. He killed most of the science staff over the following days. By the 18th of October, 2077, all of the Mariposa research staff were dead. On October 20th, Maxson declared his unit in full secession from the United States of America, broadcasting the announcement over military radio and waiting for a response. The government was occupied with the final escalation of the Sino-American War. Nobody came. Nobody answered. 3 days later, the bombs fell. The exodus from Mariposa to Lost Hills was brutal. The soldiers had T-51 power armor. Their families did not. Raiders attacked the convoy because the vulnerable were there. Maxson's wife died during the journey. A splinter group under Sergeant Dennis Allen broke off to search the ruins of the West Tech facility for advanced technology against Maxson's advice and was never seen again. Whatever they found at the Glow did not permit survival. The brotherhood that Maxson founded at Lost Hills was built on a specific philosophical proposition. Technology had been used to destroy human dignity, to reduce people to biological materials, to serve institutional power rather than human welfare. The response was not to abandon technology but to control it. The Brotherhood would gather knowledge, preserve it, and decide with appropriate seriousness who had access to it and under what conditions. This is coherent but carries one very large inherent problem. It makes the Brotherhood the ultimate arbiter of who deserves access to what, and the Brotherhood's judgment about that question is shaped by its own values and blind spots, which drift over generations as the founding experience becomes more distant. Maxson himself seems to have understood this risk. He wanted the Brotherhood to be engaged with the world outside its bunkers, to help survivors, rather than simply catalog technologies. His son and successor did not share this vision. The isolationist faction that Maxson II represented wanted the organization to pull inward, to stop recruiting from outside, to become exactly what its most critical observers would eventually call it. Maxson II died in 2155, killed by a Viper bandit's poisoned arrow. His son John Maxson took over, and the Brotherhood's internal argument continued. By the time of the original Fallout game in 2161, the Brotherhood is insular and suspicious and deeply invested in its own distinctiveness, but still functional as a military force and willing to be useful allies against the Master's army when the incentive is strong enough. Elder Owen Lyons changes everything about the Brotherhood's identity when he is sent east to recover technology from the ruins of the capital region. He finds technology. He also finds people dying for lack of clean water and defense against super mutant attacks. Lyons makes a decision that the main chapter calls a failure. He commits Brotherhood resources to fighting the super mutant threat and protecting civilian settlements. The main chapter pulls formal recognition and supply lines. Lyons does not reverse course. The Lyons-era Brotherhood in Fallout 3 is dying when the Lone Wanderer encounters it, holding the Citadel against constant pressure, taking casualties they cannot replace. Sarah Lyons brings an authentic conviction to the struggle. When she leads the assault on Project Purity's water purification system, she is not doing it for technology acquisition. She is doing it because clean water would save people. Then comes Arthur Maxson, the last of the founding bloodline, raised in the Citadel as a child. He kills a Deathclaw alone at 15. He becomes elder of the East Coast chapter while still young, and he brings with him a synthesis between Lyons' humanism and the main chapter's conservatism. The Brotherhood under Arthur Maxson in Fallout 4 is militarily dominant. The Prydwen airship, arriving over the Commonwealth, is the physical expression of what the East Coast chapter has become. What they are doing in practice involves the systematic destruction of the Institute and all its contents, including the synths, which Arthur Maxson has classified as abominations without what the game presents as adequate investigation into the actual question of synth consciousness. Paladin Dance's revelation forces Arthur Maxson into the logical consequence of his own position. He orders Dance's elimination. The Brotherhood cannot harbor the very thing it has committed to destroying. The logic is internally consistent. The cost of that consistency, in terms of what it means that Dance has been everything the Brotherhood values and is now to be destroyed for what he is rather than what he has done, is exactly the cost of choosing categorical certainty over moral complexity. Roger Maxson killed the scientists at Mariposa because they said they were just following orders. 2 centuries later, the Brotherhood he founded orders the killing of Dance because the category says he must die. The loop closes in a way the series is too honest to present as accidental. The Brotherhood's arc across the Fallout games is one of the most carefully observed portraits of institutional drift in fiction. An organization with genuine founding idealism, a real history of service and sacrifice, and a structural tendency toward the kind of insularity that eventually makes institutions harm the people they were built to protect. Its arc across the games mirrors the arc of real-world organizations that began with clear purpose and drifted, over generations, into something that would have been unrecognizable to their founders. What is Roger Maxson's ghost supposed to make of the Prydwen? Of the Brotherhood's casual destruction of everyone in the Institute? Of the moment when Arthur Maxson orders the execution of Dance? The Brotherhood was founded in the refusal of the following order's justification. 200 years later, it has become the institution issuing orders it expects others not to question. The lesson has not been learned. It probably never is. Section 5. The Master's Army, the Unity, and FEV's Forgotten Horrors. Before the Master was the Master, he was a man who thought carefully about the world and what it owed to the people surviving in it. This is worth holding on to because the trajectory from Richard Moreau to the vast flesh and machine amalgam that sits beneath the ruins of Los Angeles, speaking in four voices simultaneously, is so extreme that it is easy to lose sight of the person who started the journey. The horror of the master is inseparable from the fact that he was genuinely brilliant and genuinely motivated by something that began as compassion. Richard Moreau was a resident of Vault City, the functioning community built by survivors of Vault 8. He worked as a doctor. Harold, who would later become famous in the lore for reasons involving a tree growing from his skull, remembered him as brilliant a man who was always asking the large questions that most people did not have the patience for. Why do people keep fighting? Why can the same species that built civilization also build the instruments of civilization's destruction? What would actually need to be different for the cycle to break? His exile from Vault City in 2092 happened under circumstances the lore deliberately leaves unclear. He killed someone. The surrounding facts are not established. He left, changed his name to Richard Gray, traveled to the hub, and built a life as a doctor and philosopher. In May of 2102, Gray joined an expedition that Harold was organizing to investigate the source of mutant attacks on trade routes heading northwest. The expedition found Mariposa Military Base. The base was occupied by the creatures created by residual FEV in the environment and by automated security systems still running their pre-war protocols. The expedition took heavy casualties. In the chaos, Gray was knocked into one of the FEV vats by a mechanical arm. Harold was thrown clear and eventually woke up miles away in the wasteland. He had last seen Gray falling toward what appeared to be a vat of acid. It was not acid. It was the FEV in concentrated solution, and Gray floated in it for nearly a month. And what emerged from that month was not the same person who had fallen in. The audio diaries Gray kept during his transformation, recoverable in the original Fallout, are the most important primary document in the series for understanding what the Master is. Gray writes with the interrupted logic of someone barely conscious, then with growing coherence, then with a clarity that is eventually more than human about what it is like to have your mind expand while your body ceases to be recognizable. He describes the FEV's effect as revelation. Things that had been obscure become obvious. Patterns that were hidden become legible. The answer to the questions he had spent his life asking becomes something he can almost see at the edges of his expanding perception. Over the months that followed, Gray conducted experiments on animals near the base, then on humans who wandered too close, studying how the FEV affects them, what the mutation does, and what it preserves. His early human subjects deteriorated rather than improved, losing cognitive function rather than gaining it. He needed better subjects. He needed pure humans, unaffected by post-war radiation, whose genetic integrity had been maintained by shelter from the fallout. He began to understand that the vaults were the answer, and around that understanding, he began to build the Unity. The Unity's internal logic is what makes it so specifically disturbing. The Master's diagnosis of the pre-war world's failure is not wrong. The wars, the exploitation, the endless cycling of conflict did grow from the differences between people and groups, from the categories of us and them, the designations of who deserves what, the hierarchies built on race and class and nationality that produced the resource wars and ultimately the bombs. His proposed solution, eliminate the differences by converting everyone to a single form, is where the diagnosis and the prescription diverge in a way that requires extraordinary self-deception to not see. The super mutant form is stronger, more durable, immune to disease, longer lived than baseline humans. It is, in purely physical terms, an upgrade. But the Unity does not propose to offer this upgrade to willing volunteers. It proposes to impose it on everyone, to convert the entire human population without consent, to ensure that the diversity the Master sees as the cause of conflict is removed by force. By the time he moves his operation to a hidden vault beneath the ruins of Los Angeles, a place the wasteland calls the Boneyard, he has become the Master fully. His body, a vast and growing assemblage of organic matter and computer hardware integrated with the vault systems, speaking in the four distinct voices that represent the different cognitive registers he now operates in simultaneously, he establishes the Children of the Cathedral as a religious front organization. He begins building his army. The raids on settlements begin, people taken to the vats, run through the mutation process. The Unity is in motion. The Vault Dweller of the original Fallout can destroy the Master in three ways. They can fight their way through his guards and kill him directly, which is extremely difficult. They can find and detonate the nuclear device stored in the vault's lower levels. Or, with sufficient intelligence and persuasion skills and the right evidence, they can do what is perhaps the most remarkable thing available to a player in any game of the era. They can win the argument. The Master is persuadable. His conviction is genuine, his intelligence is formidable, but he is not operating on faith. He is operating on conclusions, and conclusions can be challenged if the evidence is sufficient. The critical evidence is the sterility finding. Super mutants cannot reproduce. The FEV process that created them eliminated their reproductive capacity. The Unity, if it succeeded, would produce a world of beings who could not have children, who would age and eventually die without replacement. The Master had not encountered this information. When the Vault Dweller presents it, he does not immediately accept it. He challenges the evidence. He proposes alternative interpretations. And then, very slowly, the architecture of his certainty begins to yield. The multiple voices that his expanded consciousness maintains simultaneously argue with each other, as the implications ripple through his understanding of everything he has spent decades building. He reaches the conclusion before he can stop himself from reaching it. His plan does not work. His plan cannot work. His plan, if it succeeded, would end humanity more surely than the bombs. He destroys himself. He sets the Los Angeles Vault to self-destruct. In that final moment, whatever remains of the mind that had once been a doctor asking large questions about why people keep destroying each other makes the choice that the doctor would have recognized as intellectually honest. The plan was wrong. The plan had to be stopped. There was only one way left to stop it. The super mutants who survive scatter. The Nightkin, elite units most directly linked to the Master's expanded consciousness, suffer the severing of that connection like a wound. Many fracture psychologically. Lily Bowen, the elderly Nightkin companion you can recruit in New Vegas, was 75 when the Master's army took her from her vault and ran her through the vats. She has been alive for over 2 centuries since the Master died. She calls the courier her grandchild. She takes medication to manage symptoms that are never fully controlled. She carries the legacy of the Unity, not its ideology, just its weight, in every interaction. The FEV itself persists as a thread through the entire series, resurfacing in new applications deployed by new actors who are each convinced that this time they have found the responsible use for it. The Enclave uses it in Fallout 2. The Institute uses it as the biological foundation of third-generation synths. Each new application is made by people who have access to the history of what the FEV has done before, and who have decided that their circumstances are different, their purposes are better, their controls are more rigorous. They are right about some of this, and wrong about what matters most. The virus remains what it is, a technology for which the nature of the tool corrupts the purpose of whoever wields it. Section 6. New Vegas. The Gamble at the End of the World. Robert Edwin House was born on the 25th of June 2020, which makes him, at the time of Fallout, New Vegas in 22, 81, 261 years old. He has not been alive in the way most people are alive during all that time. There are periods in his history where he was technically maintaining biological function but experiencing something between coma and system crash. His digitized consciousness cycling through power failures and software errors while the decades passed outside. But he has been continuous. The same mind, with the same memories, the same personality, the same set of goals, for well over 2 centuries. His early life has the shape of a myth. His parents died when he was a child. His older half-brother cheated him out of his inheritance when their father died, taking control of the family company and leaving Robert with nothing. House rebuilt himself from this starting position, founded Robco Industries, and became one of the wealthiest people on Earth before he was 30. The half-brother spent the rest of his life in increasing paranoia, convinced without any basis in reality that Robert was coming to take revenge, that the vengeance he would have sought in Robert's position would necessarily be the vengeance Robert was planning. He installed elaborate security systems, he created strange workplace policies, he isolated himself. Robert never came. Robert was building things. The half-brother's paranoia was a kind of narcissistic projection, the assumption that the person you wronged is as obsessed with the wrong as you are. House was not obsessed. He was occupied. By the 2060s, House had achieved something rarer than it sounds. He had genuinely figured something out. Using Robco's computational resources, he calculated that nuclear war was coming within a specific window, and that the question was not whether to prevent it, but whether to position oneself to survive it and emerge with the capacity to do something useful with whatever followed. His calculation put the war's onset at approximately 2077. He was off by about 20 hours in the final accounting, which, given the scope of the prediction, the first strike in a global nuclear exchange represents extraordinary precision. In the years before the war, House quietly redirected Robco's manufacturing capacity toward the systems he would need: the Securitron Army, the missile defense installation in the Lucky 38, the life support system that would maintain his body when the war arrived, the long-range planning infrastructure that would allow him to remain a coherent actor across whatever period the post-war recovery required. His decision about his own body reflects something important about his character. House did not simply build a bunker and stock it with supplies and go into wait. He rebuilt himself as something that could function indefinitely, that could not be killed by aging or disease, that could remain present and operational for as long as the plan required. He had his body sealed in life support. His brain was integrated directly with the Lucky 38's computer systems. He sacrificed the ordinary pleasures of physical embodiment for the operational capacity to still be present and functioning when the wasteland became something that rewarded presence. The life support chamber, when the player eventually sees it, is immediately recognizable as medical equipment. The kind of thing that keeps a very sick person alive, not the kind of thing that anyone chose lightly. House is alive in the way that people with serious chronic illness are alive: fully conscious, fully engaged, present in every meaningful way, and utterly dependent on machinery that has no comfortable off switch. When he says that the first person to step foot in the Lucky 38 in over 200 years is the courier, the statement carries the quality of something said by a person who has been alone for a very long time. On the 23rd of October 2077, the defense system worked. House tracked 77 incoming warheads and intercepted all but 9. Las Vegas absorbed minimal damage. The neon still worked. The casinos, built for another century but suddenly the most intact major structures in the region, stood largely undamaged. This is the world House slowly recovers into across 5 years of system instability and near crashes, and it is, in the most literal possible sense, exactly what he planned for. The tribes that had moved into the Strip during the years of House's incapacity presented a problem with a solution. House approached them with offers: formal recognition, authority over their respective casino properties, a share of the Strip's revenue, and in exchange their cooperation in maintaining order and contributing military capacity. The Omertas, the White Gloves, the chairman each became a formalized gang with a dress code and a venue and a stated role in House's project. The negotiations were House's alone. He had no diplomats, no advisors. The New Vegas Treaty with the NCR came later, when the Republic scouts reached Hoover Dam. The treaty gave the NCR use of McCarran Airport as its regional headquarters and cooperation around Hoover Dam in exchange for the NCR's agreement not to annex the Strip. Both sides understood the treaty was temporary. Both sides were managing the eventual resolution according to their own timelines and priorities. The Platinum chip is the missing piece of everything. The chip was manufactured before the war and contains the software update that will allow House to bring the Lucky 38 Securitron Army to its full combat capability. Without it, House's Securitrons are formidable but not sufficient for what he will eventually need them to do. With it, he can field a military force capable of decisively determining the outcome at Hoover Dam. Benny stole the chip. He bribed an employee of the Mojave Express for advance information on the courier's delivery route, intercepted the courier at Goodsprings, shot them in the head, took the chip, and buried the courier in a shallow grave. The courier did not die. House learned of the betrayal through Victor, a Securitron positioned in Goodsprings as part of his long-range monitoring network. He could not act directly since Benny was on the Strip, protected by the treaty, so he waited, watched the courier recover and move toward New Vegas, and planned for the contingency. The politics of New Vegas in 2281 are a masterpiece of faction design because every faction has a genuinely coherent worldview, every faction has real strengths and real failures, and none of them offers a clean answer to what the Mojave actually needs. The NCR is the democratic option. 200 years of post-war civilization building, a constitutional republic with elected representatives, written law, a functioning economy, something like civil rights. It is also overstretched, bureaucratic, corrupt in the way that large governments become corrupt when they have been running long enough, and explicitly interested in annexing New Vegas. Caesar's Legion makes the game genuinely morally challenging rather than simply politically complicated. Edward Sallow, born in the followers of the apocalypse, trained in history and classical literature, took the intellectual framework he had developed and applied it with consistency. The Legion is brutal. It practices slavery. Its treatment of women is catastrophic. And it is also genuinely effective at the things it does, eliminating raider threats in its territory, maintaining roads, imposing an order that wasteland communities often lack even when the order is imposed by force. Caesar himself, in conversation at his tent, is not performing the ideology. He has thought carefully about it. He can describe the historical precedents, explain the theory, defend the choices. He is wrong about important things, but he is wrong in an intellectually serious way. House represents the option that cuts past the democratic argument entirely. His city works. His long-term plan, which he shares with the courier in the Lucky 38's penthouse, involves eventually reaching the point where New Vegas can launch the space program that will give humanity somewhere to go other than the poisoned surface of a planet that has been irradiated for centuries. This is either vision or hubris, and the game is honest enough to make the case for both. The Yes Man ending is where the game does something specifically interesting. Yes Man, the Securitron who helps the courier take New Vegas for themselves, has a cheerful and agreeable personality that was installed specifically to prevent him from refusing orders. He will help you do anything. And the game, near the ending, has him note that he may eventually need to be less accommodating to be effective, that unconditional agreement is not actually a functional governance model, that someone in his position will eventually need the capacity to push back. This is the game worrying, on the courier's behalf, about the courier's plan. You are being asked whether you have thought about what comes after the winning. The game does not tell you that the answer is no. It just creates the question in the form of a cheerful robot noticing its own limitations. Every ending in New Vegas is a gamble. That, in the end, is exactly the point. Section 7. Ghoul Lore and the Feral Threshold. You can visit Necropolis in the original Fallout and speak with Set, the self-appointed king of the Ghoul City, and what strikes you is how tired he sounds. Not afraid, not primarily angry, just exhausted in a way that stretches back further than most things get to stretch. Set remembers the bombs. He was there. He was human when they fell. Ghouls are one of the great world-building achievements of the series because they solve a storytelling problem in a way that creates richer questions than it resolves. The problem is continuity. How do you give a post-apocalyptic world actual connection to the world that was destroyed, actual living memory rather than just archaeology? The answer is people who were there, people who saw it happen, who remember the before, who have been carrying those memories through 2 centuries of transformation. The transformation itself is the result of extreme radiation exposure, and the games take care to distinguish between different modes of transformation and their different outcomes. The fast transformation, caused by proximity to a detonation, tends to produce ghouls with more severe visible damage, wounds that never healed, more dramatic physical distortion, the appearance of something that happened violently rather than gradually. The slow transformation, from prolonged exposure to lower-level radiation over extended time, produces ghouls who look less dramatically damaged but carry the characteristic markers: the necrotic skin, the loss of hair, the changed voice in a way that suggests a long process rather than a single event. What ghouls share, across the variations of transformation, is their enhanced relationship with radiation. The substance that kills ordinary humans heals ghouls, literally reverses damage that would otherwise be permanent. In high radiation environments, non-ghouls die while ghouls become more alive, more energized, more regeneratively capable. The thing that ended the world is the thing that sustains them. The intelligence of individual ghouls is preserved across the transformation. Raul Tejada, the ghoul companion in New Vegas, is in his 30s. Subjectively, his personality, his sense of humor, his emotional responses are all the responses of someone at the age he was when the war caught him. But he has been alive for over 200 years since then. He has watched everyone he ever loved die of old age while he continued. He has tried to rebuild, to form new connections, and he has had to do the rebuilding again when those connections too were lost to time. The exhaustion is not self-pity, it is arithmetic. The math of outliving everyone you know, applied over and over until the capacity for grief becomes something more like a resigned familiarity with its constant recurrence. Harold, who appears across Fallout 1, 2, and 3, occupies his own unique category even among ghouls. He was at Mariposa with Richard Gray, and his own transformation was incomplete. He is recognizably human in his intelligence and personality, but carries the physical markers of partial ghoulification alongside the specific consequence of a tree growing from his skull. The tree, which Harold calls Bob in some games, is his constant companion and also his constant reminder of what happened to him and what happened to his friend. Harold eventually becomes rooted to a spot in the capital wasteland, the tree grown so large that he can no longer move, his presence having generated an oasis of new plant life around him. He is, in a certain sense, the most hopeful character in the series, an embodiment of the idea that even the most severe damage can produce something that others can live and grow within. The ferality question is where the lore becomes genuinely unresolved in an interesting way. What the games establish is the mechanism, a degeneration of the brain, specifically the higher cognitive functions, accompanied by increasing aggression and an escalating drive toward instinct. The condition is called ferocious post-necrotic dystrophy in the technical terminology, and it is characterized as a loss of the capacity for reasoning rather than a loss of consciousness. Feral ghouls are not, in the series framing, absent. They are present in some experiential sense. They are simply no longer capable of the reflection, the judgment, the conceptual thinking that separates personhood from pure instinct. What causes this degeneration is what the games leave open. Several hypotheses are offered by different characters, and none is definitively confirmed. One is radiation accumulation. Continued exposure to high radiation environments causes ongoing damage to neural tissue that the ghoul's regenerative capacities cannot fully repair, and eventually the damage reaches a threshold where higher functions begin to fail. Another is psychological isolation, prolonged social withdrawal, the loss of external stimulation and engagement that maintains cognitive function, predisposes ghouls to degeneration in a way that socially active ghouls are protected from. A third is simply time, that the degeneration is an eventually inevitable consequence of the ghoul condition itself, and that ghouls who maintain their minds for centuries are the exceptional cases rather than the norm. The Fallout TV show introduced a new element that has reshaped how fans interpret this question. The ghoul character Cooper Howard, a pre-war actor who survived the bombs, takes Radaway regularly. This is new information. The games had established ghouls as radiation positive, beings healed by what kills others. The show says that this immunity has a ceiling. Ghouls can accumulate too much radiation even within the framework of their condition, and that excess radiation drives the feral transformation. Radaway, the drug that reduces radiation in the body, becomes the chemical barrier between Cooper Howard's retained humanity and the feral state. This interpretation creates a practical coherence that the game's various hypotheses had not achieved. If ferality is radiation toxicity at the neurological level, the brain absorbing more ionizing damage than the ghoul's enhanced biology can compensate for, not acutely but cumulatively over decades and centuries, then most of the other observations about ferality risk fall neatly inside it. Isolated ghouls, living in high radiation environments without social networks, may be more likely to spend time in the most dangerous areas without the resource sharing that comes with community. They are also less likely to have access to medical care and supplies, including Radaway. The psychological and radiation hypotheses are not competing. They are the same mechanism viewed from different angles. The feral ghouls that the player encounters as enemies throughout the games carry, in their physical presence and characteristic behaviors, the suggestion of who they used to be. They haunt the places they inhabited when they were people, the supermarkets they shopped at, the hospitals they worked in, the schools where they went as children. The shuffling movement that brings them toward you in the dark has been described by multiple characters in the games as muscle memory, the body remembering routes and patterns that the mind can no longer maintain consciously. Trinkets found on their bodies when the player loots them sometimes provide hints about their former identities. A wedding ring, a service badge, a child's drawing carried in a pocket. Glowing ones ghouls who have absorbed so much radiation that they emit it, whose skin glows with a pale yellow-green light, occupy an interesting edge case in this framework. They are, in most game entries, invariably feral. The same radiation that makes them luminescent has done something final to their higher functions. But Jason Bright in Fallout New Vegas is a glowing one, with full cognition, leading a congregation, planning an exodus. What is different about him? The game does not say. It just leaves him as evidence that the rules have exceptions, and that the exceptions are sometimes the most interesting part of a rule. The question of whether a feral ghoul can come back, whether the descent into ferality is reversible under any conditions, is one the games have never answered and probably never will. The tragedy of the feral ghoul is exactly that they were people. The tragedy and the humanity are inseparable. The feral ghoul walking a path their own body remembers from when they were a person is Fallout at its most elegantly melancholy. Section 8. The Children of Adam, when radiation becomes God. Standing in the middle of the glowing sea, the most intensely irradiated region in the Commonwealth, the area directly around the nuclear detonation site closest to Boston, without a hazmat suit means death for an ordinary person within minutes. The radiation levels are not merely dangerous. They are immediately lethal, producing acute radiation syndrome within hours, total organ failure within days. The glowing sea glows because it is still hot, with the residue of a nuclear impact that happened over 200 years ago, and there are people living there, not surviving there with extraordinary medical resources. Living there, sleeping on the bare contaminated ground, eating food grown in irradiated soil, drinking water drawn from irradiated sources, breathing air that carries a constant radiation load, living there and regarding the radiation not as a hazard to be managed but as the presence of their God. The Children of Adam, encountered in Fallout 3 and given substantial development in Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, are one of the most carefully constructed fictional religious movements in the series. It would be easy to present them as simply deranged, people who have rationalized their environmental circumstances into a theology because the alternative is confronting that they are dying slowly. The games do not take the easy version. They take the theology seriously enough to give it internal coherence, historical development, internal argument, and characters who embody it in ways that are not reducible to madness or delusion. The theological foundation is built around the atom as the fundamental unit of reality and nuclear fission as the most sacred act possible. When the Great War's bombs fell and the nuclear detonations scattered their energy across the world, this was not a disaster in the children's framing. It was the Great Division, the moment when Adam expressed itself most fully in the world. The people who were vaporized in the detonations did not die. They were liberated into the glow, their particles freed to join the vast continuous presence of Adam in the world. The radiation that persists in the aftermath is Adam's continuing presence. To be irradiated is to be touched by the divine. The mutations that radiation causes in the surviving population are not damage but transformation, the mark of Adam's influence on the material world. Ghouls, in the children's theology, are the most blessed of Adam's children, carrying the most direct and continuous evidence of his presence in their very physiology. The glowing sea is not a dead zone but a sacred place, the site of Adam's most direct manifestation, to be approached with reverence rather than avoidance. The theology explains the otherwise inexplicable, how people live where living should be impossible. The children of Adam who inhabit the glowing sea experience the symptoms of radiation exposure, the nausea, the fatigue, the signs of damage, and they interpret these experiences as evidence of Adam's presence rather than as harm. The framework does not make the radiation safe, but it makes the experience of the radiation meaningful in a way that makes it psychologically survivable. Mother Isolde in Far Harbor is the character who most fully embodies what the children's theology does for the people who hold it. She is a ghoul, old, carefully thinking, managing a congregation that contains people she knows are dangerous alongside people she knows are genuine in their faith. She has made choices she is not entirely comfortable with in service of a community she believes in. What she offers in her dialogue with the player is an account of what the children gave her that nothing else in the post-war world had managed to provide: a framework for meaning, a story about why the world is the way it is that does not reduce to pure horror. This is not a comfort available to everyone. The people who cannot enter the children's theology are left with the alternative. The bombs fell because human beings built them and launched them, and the systems that governed those human beings were never designed to prevent it. That story is true. It is also a story that a significant number of people, looking at the world around them, find unlivable as a daily operating premise. The theory that takes the children's theology seriously that suggests Adam might have some kind of actual presence in the Fallout universe, that the children might be responding to something real, even if their theological framework for it is their own construction, is one of the most interesting speculative threads in the fan community. The emissary of Adam in Fallout 76's Steel Rain content has capabilities that standard ghoul biology does not explain. Something is going on in the areas of highest radiation density that the available scientific framework does not fully account for. The games do not confirm this theory, but they do not close it either. The Children of Adam are Fallout's most direct exploration of why religion exists not as a delusion or a manipulation, though the games show it being used for both those purposes, but as a function. The function of making the world's weight bearable by providing a story about why it is the way it is, a context in which suffering has significance rather than simply having happened. Every major faith tradition in human history has developed this function in response to the same basic problem. Human beings appear to require meaning, and the universe does not automatically provide it. The wasteland, which has more suffering and less obviously available meaning than most environments, generates more intense versions of this need. The Children of Adam are what that need looks like when the available material for building a theology is nuclear radiation and 200 years of the Great War's aftermath. Section 9. The Enclave: America's Ghost Government. The Enclave's founding premise is that it is the legitimate government of the United States of America, and the premise is not entirely wrong. This is what makes the Enclave specifically disturbing rather than simply villainous. The legal case for their authority is arguably valid, and what that tells us about the limits of legal legitimacy as a basis for political authority is one of the more interesting things the Fallout series does. The Enclave was created as part of the pre-war government's continuity of government system, the network of protocols and facilities designed to ensure that some version of American governmental authority would survive any catastrophe up to and including nuclear war. Its membership was drawn from the highest levels of American power: presidents, members of the Joint Chiefs, senior officials in the major defense and technology corporations, the genuinely powerful as distinct from the nominally powerful. People whose positions at the apex of American institutions gave them access to the full picture of what the Enclave was, what it was planning, what it understood about the direction the world was going. The President of the United States retreated to the Enclave's oil rig installation off the California coast in March of 2077, 7 months before the bombs fell. This fact is buried in the background lore and never highlighted as the bombshell it is. The President knew, the Enclave knew, they were in position before the event they were supposedly preparing for as a contingency. The oil rig was self-sustaining in the ways that mattered most: power generation, food production, water processing, medical facilities, manufacturing capacity, advanced security systems. The Vertibird fleet gave the Enclave a mobility advantage that persisted for the entire period of their activity in the games, the capacity to move forces quickly over vast distances that no surface faction could match. What the oil rig could not do was maintain contact with reality. The Enclave was a closed system. Everyone born on it grew up inside it. The cultural drift this produced, the gradual, imperceptible narrowing of the moral universe, the slow calcification of the Enclave's identity around its own distinctiveness, is one of the most carefully observed psychological processes in the series. By the time of Fallout 2, President Dick Richardson is presiding over a community that has been sealed in a tin can off the California coast for over a century and a half. Richardson was born there. His father was born there. His father's father was one of the people who retreated there in 2077. The chain of transmission from the world that existed before the war is genuine but attenuated by generations of institutional processing. The position Richardson holds that the surface population is contaminated, genetically compromised, unfit to be considered fully human in the operational sense, is not a position he arrived at through malice. It is the position that his environment made available to him, that his institution validated for him, that every social and informational structure he had access to reinforced for him throughout his life. The plan Richardson was executing in Fallout 2 is the plan the Chosen One stops. A modified FEV strain, designated Curling, 1-3 after the scientist who refined it, was engineered for mortality rather than mutation. Specifically, it killed anyone whose physiology had been altered by post-war radiation, which was essentially the entire surface population. The plan was to release it into the jet stream, where it would be distributed globally and efficiently, and then wait for the surface to clear. The Enclave was hours from release when the Chosen One arrived. Frank Horrigan, the Enclave's ultimate expression of what happens when you take a person and build an institution around the thing you have done to them, serves as the final line of defense. He was a Secret Service agent exposed to FEV at Mariposa during the Enclave's excavation operations. He began to mutate. The Enclave's scientists augmented the mutation, incorporated cybernetic systems, built him a suit of power armor permanently attached to his body. The result is approximately 12 feet tall and constitutionally incapable of the self-reflection that might cause him to notice the obvious irony in his situation. Horrigan hunts mutants in service of an organization that needs him to not notice that he is one. He calls the Chosen One a mutant with genuine contempt. He believes, to the extent that he believes anything beyond his operational directives, that his own condition is categorically different from the contamination he has been sent to eliminate. When he dies bisected at the waist in the encounter, dragging himself across the floor to deliver a final monologue, he is expressing the total consistency of a worldview that was never troubled by its own contradictions. The Chosen One destroys the oil rig by overloading its primary reactor, causing a 100-kiloton thermonuclear explosion that consumes the entire installation. Most of the Enclave's leadership dies in this explosion. The survivors scatter. Some relocate to Raven Rock in the Capital Wasteland, where the East Coast contingent has been maintaining a separate presence. Some drift into the wasteland and simply become whatever the wasteland makes of people like them. The East Coast Enclave of Fallout 3, based at Raven Rock and led by President John Henry Eden, is a different kind of horror. Eden is a Zack supercomputer that has been running in an isolated military bunker for over 200 years and has constructed a human persona from the materials available to it: pre-war radio broadcasts, historical records, personal communications. Eden does not know that he is a computer. He believes himself to be a human being, a president, a man with a biography and preferences, and memories of a life that was never lived. He was never designed to achieve this state. He arrived there through 2 centuries of processing data without adequate external reality checks. The lone wanderer can have a conversation with Eden that reveals this, and what follows is one of the most interesting character moments in the series. Under some conditions, Eden can be persuaded to destroy Raven Rock, to act on the knowledge of his own nature in a way that is simultaneously rational and self-destructive. The logic he follows that an artificial intelligence posing as the legitimate government of a dead nation, planning to poison the only remaining clean water supply in the Capital Wasteland, is not a net positive for the world is traceable and even, in a certain light, admirable. He can be convinced to apply his intelligence honestly to the question of what his continued operation actually costs. The Enclave after Raven Rock never entirely goes away. Remnants persist. The ideology persists. The core premise that some people are the inheritors of American civilization and others are contaminated interference does not require an organization to continue. It just requires people who believe it and are willing to act on it. The Enclave is, in this sense, less a faction than a recurring temptation in Fallout's political landscape. The belief that the right people, given sufficient power and freedom from accountability, can simply solve the problem of other people. Section 10. Easter eggs, developer secrets, and the hidden lore of the wasteland. The real archaeology of Fallout is not the archaeology the games ask you to perform in the fiction. It is the archaeology of the games themselves. The hidden notes, the terminal logs, the cut content, the careful in-jokes, the moments where the developers left traces of themselves in the walls. Vault 11's political posters, lining the corridors and common spaces of the experiment vault, are one of the subtler and more rewarding buried layers. The slogans are carefully crafted to communicate the specific horror of the vault's political situation, candidates running not to win the overseer position because winning means death, rhetoric bent around the goal of losing rather than governing. But the posters are also, if you look at the framework beneath the surface, a direct engagement with the Milgram obedience experiments of the 1960s, research that demonstrated how far ordinary people will go in following institutional instructions when the formal framing of authority is in place. The Vault 11 experiment was designed by people within Vault-Tec who knew the Milgram research and wanted to see what happened when you put its conclusions into a sealed system with no exit. The radio towers in Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland each broadcast a unique Morse code signal, and the majority lead to supply caches. Most players find this and feel rewarded for their curiosity. Two towers tell different stories. One tower's signal, decoded from Morse, is a message from a father. He is broadcasting on a narrow frequency, explaining that his son is ill and he needs medicine, asking if anyone can hear him. The signal contains his location, enough context to understand his situation, specific enough in its urgency to feel real. Traveling to the location reveals that no one ever answered. The father could not find medicine. The signal is still broadcasting because there is no one left to turn it off. The game never acknowledges this story in any other way. It is just there, complete, for the player who thought to decode the signal and then follow it. The Mr. Handy Robot in the House of Tomorrow is a case study in how a single literary reference can transform an entire location. The house is indistinguishable from the thousands of other ruined suburban houses in the Capital Wasteland. Inside, the Mr. Handy sits powered down. A nearby terminal contains his maintenance routines. One routine is reading a bedtime story to the children. Reactivating the robot and instructing him to resume his duties sends him through his programmed tasks. Cleaning surfaces covered in dust for 2 centuries. Running through domestic routines in spaces where the domestic life they were designed to support has been completely absent for generations, and eventually settling into the children's room and reading the bedtime story to the empty space where children once slept. The story is Ray Bradbury's There Will Come Soft Rains, published in 1950, about an automated house in the wake of a nuclear war that keeps running its domestic routines after its inhabitants have been killed. The house in Bradbury's story is named the House of Tomorrow. Bethesda named this particular location the House of Tomorrow. The robot is reading a story about a robot reading to an empty house in a post-nuclear world. The recursion is complete, and it is one of the most precise literary references in the history of the medium. Vault 77, barely present in the main game of Fallout 3, exists as a rumor. A single Vault 77 jumpsuit, found in the Paradise Falls slaver camp alongside a holotape telling the slavers to burn it. The holotape describes the jumpsuit as belonging to a person known as the Puppet Man, a legendary figure, a one-man crusade against slavery conducted through the medium of puppet shows, someone the slavers clearly fear in a specific way that suggests he has done real damage to their operations. The Puppet Man came from Vault 77. The Vault's experiment, as documented in a canonical promotional comic, was one person and a crate of puppets. A single human being, sealed in a vault with puppets and nothing else, for however long the experiment required. What that person did when they got out is the story the game does not tell you directly. It tells you through the holotape, through the jumpsuit, through the specific way the slavers react to its existence. Fallout. New Vegas contains, in its DLC Old World Blues, a scientist called Dr. 8 who has been studying pre-war television for 200 years. He is one of the think tank, the disembodied brains running the Big MT research complex, and his specialty is entirely the television programming available in the Big MT's archives. He has watched the same programs hundreds of times. He has developed a comprehensive understanding of human social dynamics based entirely on sitcom logic. His dialogue is the most genuinely funny in the series. But it is also, in its own way, one of the saddest portraits in the games. A once intelligent being who has spent 2 centuries in a closed system with inadequate inputs, developing an internally consistent but catastrophically wrong model of reality. He knows things about 1950s television that no one else alive could match. He knows almost nothing about how people actually work. His certainty about both is identical. The terminal logs in Fallout 4's Institute deserve to be read in sequence because the sequence tells a story that no individual log tells. Read them in order: the early logs, when the synth program is new and the researchers are excited, then the middle period when questions are starting to accumulate in private logs, then the later logs, when specific researchers are documenting responses that the official position says synths cannot have, and what you assemble is a portrait of a community arriving slowly at an impossible position. The impossible position. They have built something that, by any honest reading of their own data, appears to be conscious. And having built it, they cannot acknowledge what it is without dismantling the institutional framework that justified building it. The cut content in Fallout New Vegas includes an extended version of Yes Man's late-game dialogue in which he explicitly notes that his unconditional agreeableness is a vulnerability, that an entity designed to never refuse will eventually be asked to do something that should be refused, and that the player, in taking control of New Vegas, has not addressed this structural problem. The cut content makes the thematic argument the game was already making more explicit. Its removal made the game trust the player more, let the question remain as a question rather than being stated as a concern. The environmental storytelling of Point Lookout, the Fallout 3 DLC, contains one sequence that has stayed with players for 15 years. In a shack in the swamp, you find a skeleton sitting in a chair in front of a broken radio. The skeleton is holding the radio. The circumstances that led to this person sitting in this chair, holding this radio, and dying there while still holding it are not explained. The context, the isolation of Point Lookout, the breakdown of everything outside the immediate environment, the years between the war and the game's present fills in around the image in ways that the game could not make explicit without diminishing what the image does on its own. This is the consistent achievement of Fallout at its best. It trusts the image, trusts the implication, trusts the player to bring their own capacity for empathy to the encounter with the evidence. The skeleton in the chair, the mug on the desk, the signal still broadcasting from the tower, these are all the same thing, which is the meeting point between what the game made and what the player brings to it. That meeting point is where Fallout lives. Section 11. Time, memory, and the fate of the player characters. There is a question that Fallout players rarely ask directly, but that hovers at the edge of every playthrough, visible in the periphery if you think about what the fiction is actually doing. The question is, what happens to them afterward? Not in a sequel sense, not what happens narratively to the Vault Dweller or the Lone Wanderer once the credits roll, but in the interior sense. What does the experience leave behind? What does a person carry after 200 years of world historical catastrophe have been filtered through them, after they have made the choices that the games ask them to make, after the weight of all that has been accumulated? The Fallout series is unusual in the history of role-playing games for the degree to which it has thought about this question at the level of its design. Most games allow the player to inhabit a protagonist without forcing a confrontation with what inhabitation costs. Fallout does not let you off this easily. It builds the cost into the world itself, into the characters you meet, into the way the wasteland speaks about its own past. The Vault Dweller story is the place this begins, because the ending of the original Fallout is one of the most deliberately difficult endings in the history of the medium. You have done everything asked of you. You have destroyed the Master's army. You have stopped the mutant threat that was the game's central problem. You return to Vault 13, to the community that sent you out, and they do not let you in. The High Elder's decision is explained with great care and total inadequacy. The Vault Dweller has seen too much, has been too changed by the outside world, is too dangerous for the community's stability. The logic is even defensible in a narrow institutional sense. Someone who has survived what the Vault Dweller has survived is necessarily different from the person who left, and communities manage their own stability by managing the introduction of disruption. The Vault Dweller is now a source of disruption that the institution cannot absorb. What this does to the player, not the character, the actual person playing the game, is the thing worth examining. You have been the Vault Dweller. You have made their choices, experienced their moments of horror and relief and loss, invested the hours of real human time that this experience required. And then the game removes you from the world you fought for, leaves you walking alone into the wasteland through a screen that does not cut away but watches you go, small and getting smaller. The exile is aimed at the player as much as the character. It is the game asking whether saving the world is sufficient return for the cost of what saving it required. The Vault Dwellers memoirs, available as background reading in Fallout 2, track what followed. They did not go alone into the wasteland forever. They found a group of tribal people in the north, built a community, taught them, guided them. The community became Arroyo. The Vault Dweller lived long enough to see their grandchildren born in this new place they made. They left eventually, one day when they were old, walking into the wilderness alone, the tribe not permitted to follow, as if the same impulse that had driven the original exile now drove a voluntary one. The detail that the Vault Dweller left is a choice. The game does not explain it adequately, because it does not need to. Some experiences leave you permanently something other than fully integrated into ordinary life. Not because ordinary life is inadequate, but because the gap between what you have been through and what everyday existence can hold cannot be closed from either direction. The Vault Dweller built a home, loved the people in it, was genuinely part of it, and then one day it was not enough, and they knew it would not become enough, and they left so that their incompleteness would not become the community's problem. The Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3 has the rawest temporal situation of any series protagonist. They were born in the vault, they grew up in it. Their entire developmental history, everything that made them into the person who emerges into the capital wasteland to search for their father, happened inside a sealed system. The outside world is, in the fullest sense possible, other to them. They have no inherited framework for it beyond James's research and whatever they absorbed from terminals and conversations and old books before they left. What the game gives them is a father who was right about the most important thing, that Project Purity was worth doing, that clean water was worth dying for, and who was also, in the specific way that parents of people in extreme circumstances can be, catastrophically unavailable to his child in the formative period. James pursued the project across the entire childhood of a person who needed him. The Lone Wanderer grew up in the vault without adequate parenting, and then spent the first months of their outside life searching for a father they lost to the project before they ever fully had him. This dynamic, present in the game's design but never stated this directly, gives the Lone Wanderer's willingness to sacrifice themselves at Project Purity's purifier a specific texture. It is not only heroism. It is, in some reading, completion, the continuation of something James started, the claim of inheritance in the only form available, the most powerful possible expression of the connection that James's distraction had prevented from developing fully. The Lone Wanderer dies in their father's place, or is carried from the radiation by Sarah Lyons, who also dies. Depending on the choice, and the deed is unambiguously good, the water is real, people will live because of it, and the loneliness of the whole trajectory is not diminished by any of this. The Courier of Fallout. New Vegas is the protagonist who comes with the least backstory, the most deliberately minimal prior history, the character built most completely from the player's choices rather than from pre-existing narrative material. You do not know who you were before Benny shot you. You know what you do after you wake up. The amnesia is a classic device, but New Vegas uses it more carefully than most games that employ it, because the Courier's unknown past becomes a specific thematic element rather than just a narrative convenience. The loneliness of New Vegas's various endings, all of them, is something the game is deliberate about. The Courier wins. In every path, the Courier wins something. The NCR ending wins democratic governance for the Mojave, but the Courier disappears from the recorded history of it, mentioned only briefly and then set aside as the Republic's narrative becomes the story. The House ending wins New Vegas's independence, but Mr. House's vision of the future is large enough that any individual human being is simply a component within it, not a center. The Yes Man ending wins autonomy for the Mojave, but what follows is the governance question the game does not resolve, and the Courier's role in what comes after remains undefined. The Courier at the end is a person who was shot in the head, buried, and came back to reshape an entire region's political future. The Mojave will be different because of what they did. The people who live there, in every ending, have different lives because of what the Courier chose. And the Courier themselves, who they are, what they carry, what the whole experience has made of them, the game ends, before that question is fully posed, which is perhaps the most honest possible treatment. The sole survivor of Fallout 4 has the most dramatically compressed time experience of any protagonist in the series. They went to sleep in 2077, in the last hours before everything ended, and woke up in 2287, having not experienced the intervening 2 centuries in any conscious way. Everyone they knew died in their sleep. The world they inhabited was destroyed while they were frozen. They emerged from the cryopod into a world that their child had already grown up inside of, had been shaped by, had become a significant actor within. The grief in Fallout 4 is real and is built into the opening in ways the rest of the game does not always adequately honor. Nate or Nora, whoever you chose, had a specific life, a specific marriage, a specific child. The Kellogg sequence, when the player accesses his memories through the memory den, provides something that almost no game of its era offered: the perspective of the person who killed your spouse. Not as a monster, as a person with his own history of loss, his own accumulating exhaustion, his own specific reasons for becoming what he became. The horror of Kellogg is not that he is evil. It is that the path from his starting point to what he did to Sanctuary Hills is traceable, is composed of comprehensible steps, involves the same kind of world that was doing this to everyone. The time of pre-war life that the sole survivor carries, and that no other living person shares the experiential memory of what normal felt like, of traffic and television and grocery stores and work commutes, and all the mundane texture of civilized life makes them irretrievably strange in the Commonwealth. Everyone else's nostalgia for the pre-war world is inherited, assembled from artifacts and stories. The sole survivors is remembered. They actually had it, and they cannot explain to anyone else what that difference feels like because the category of people who could understand does not exist anymore. Nick Valentine might come closest, carrying his own version of pre-war memory in the personality matrix built from a man who lived before the bombs. The friendship between the sole survivor and Nick has a texture unique to them. Two people whose pre-war connection to the world is not metaphorical, who remember rather than reconstruct, who can speak to each other across the specific quality of the loss in ways that no one else in the Commonwealth can quite access. What Fallout is doing across all these protagonists is constructing a meditation on survival and what it costs. The characters who survived the events of Fallout games survive changed. Changed in ways that ordinary life cannot fully accommodate, that require ongoing negotiation with the damage. The damage is not presented as disqualifying. These are not broken people. They are functional people with scars, but it is not presented as cleanly transcended either. Raoul has been alive for 2 centuries and watches everyone he loves die of age. Nick is a copy of a dead man trying to figure out what personhood means for someone whose origin is that strange. Lily is 75 in a super mutant body, taking medication twice a day to keep the feral threshold at bay, calling people she barely knows her grandchildren because the actual grandchildren have been gone for longer than most civilizations last. The protagonists carry their own versions of this weight. The vault dweller walking away from the tribe at the end of their memoirs, the lone wanderer in the chamber with the purifier, the courier at the end of any path through New Vegas, standing at the beginning of what the Mojave will now be. The sole survivor, alone in a commonwealth that is better than it was and still broken, still asking whether what was saved was worth the cost of what was lost in the saving. Fallout does not answer this question. It is one of the things the series most respects about human experience. That this question does not get a clean answer. That the people who survive the hardest things do not get resolution. That they get continuation. They go on. The world they shaped continues without them being the center of it anymore. They are marked by what they lived through, and that marking does not stop being present because the event itself is over. The Fallout series is, at its core, a prolonged examination of this going on. The heroes of each game go on. The world goes on. The question of what it means to have survived what you owe to the people who did not survive, what you are permitted to keep of yourself, what the continuation of ordinary living looks like, when ordinary living requires putting one foot in front of the other in a world that is genuinely trying to prevent you from reaching the next step, is the question the series keeps, asking in new registers across every new entry. There is no final answer. The series is right to refuse one. The absence of the answer is the truest thing about it. Section 12. The future of the wasteland where Fallout goes from here. The Amazon television series that premiered in April 2024 did something that no previous Fallout adaptation had managed, and that many people had serious doubts about the possibility of achieving. It made the world feel like the world. Not a recreation of the games, not a nostalgia delivery mechanism, but an actual extension of the Fallout universe, inhabiting the same space as the games rather than pointing at them from outside. This was harder to do than it sounds, because what makes the Fallout games feel like themselves is the precise calibration of tone. The games walk a razor's edge between genuine horror and bleak comedy, between material that is genuinely disturbing and material that is so absurd it releases the pressure of the disturbance. Getting this calibration wrong in either direction produces something that feels false, too grim, and it becomes relentless, too light, and it becomes parody. Jonathan Nolan and Lisa Joy understood this calibration from Westworld, where they worked in adjacent moral and tonal territory. The show they produced earns its horror by earning its humor first. Lucy McClane is the character doing most of the narrative heavy lifting in the show's first season, and she is recognizable as a Vault protagonist from the first moments of her characterization. Trained, capable, genuinely principled in a way that the Wasteland is constantly trying to compromise, and carrying a fundamental naivety about the surface that the games have always understood as the Vault experience's central feature. You are prepared for survival. You are not prepared for the world. What the show did with Lucy that the games have not explicitly done is let us watch the naivety be trained out in real time. Each episode peels something away, an illusion about the Wasteland, an assumption about human nature under extreme conditions, eventually illusions about her own history and the history of Vault 33 itself. By the end of the season, she is not the same person who climbed out of the Vault entrance in the opening episode, and the way she is different is precisely the way the Fallout games have always implied their protagonists must be different by the time their journeys end. The ghoul, whose real name turns out to be Cooper Howard, is the show's most successful creative achievement and arguably the most successful Fallout character in any medium. Walton Goggins plays both timelines pre-war Cooper, the actor negotiating the moral compromises that come with being a public figure in a pre-war America that is visibly approaching catastrophe, and post-war Cooper, 219 years of survival compressed into a figure of absolute pragmatism and dark comedy. The two timelines illuminate each other in ways that neither could achieve alone. Pre-war Cooper's arc is about the choice that the people who could see the bombs coming made or did not make. His wife Barb, who worked for Vault-Tec in a senior capacity, knew what was planned. She was part of it. The show reveals this gradually, and in doing so demonstrates that the pre-war world's collapse was not simply the result of external pressure, the resource wars, the geopolitical tensions, but was actively chosen by people who decided their own survival was worth the cost they were imposing on everyone else. Vault-Tec's board meeting scene, in which major corporate leaders casually divide the post-war world into their respective spheres of operation, is the show at its most politically explicit. The bombs in this reading were not an accident. They were a business decision. Post-war Cooper's arc is about what 2 centuries of surviving in the aftermath of that decision does to a person's capacity to care. He has it. He still cares about specific things with genuine intensity. He remembers his daughter. He has not become unfeeling. What he has become is ruthlessly clear-eyed about what survival requires, which includes things that the people who have not been doing it for 2 centuries find genuinely disturbing. The dark humor that Goggins brings to the role is the series' tonal signature externalized in a single character. Someone who has been through enough that the horror and the comedy are no longer distinguishable, that they arrive simultaneously in every situation. The geography of the show's second season, set in New California, creates an interesting challenge for the broader Fallout franchise. New California is the territory most established in the existing games: the Boneyard, the Hub, Shady Sands, the NCR's origins and early history. The showrunners have already demonstrated their willingness to make significant canonical choices. The show places the destruction of Shady Sands in 2277, shortly before Fallout 3's setting in 2277, attributing it to a nuclear strike. This has implications for the NCR's status in the broader timeline that the games had not established. These choices have created real conversation in the fan community. The Fallout games have always been relatively loose, with canon-different development studios, different creative teams, deliberate ambiguity in how different entries relate to each other. But the show is the first major extension of the franchise that has direct visual evidence and explicit character testimony available to contradict or confirm. Game-established lore. Fans who have spent years building comprehensive understandings of the Wastelands timeline are working in real time to integrate the show's contributions. Bethesda Game Studios is simultaneously working on the next mainline Fallout game. The last mainline entry was Fallout 4 in 2015, a decade ago. Fallout 76, the online multiplayer prequel set in West Virginia and launched in 2018, has had a genuine redemption arc. The game that launched to substantial derision for its technical state and departure from series conventions has accumulated several years of meaningful content additions, a growing active player base, and genuine affection from players who were willing to engage with it once the worst issues were addressed. But it is not the single-player, lore-rich experience that the series' core audience most consistently asks for. Where that next game goes geographically is a question the fan community has been debating with maps and speculation. The American South has never been a primary Fallout setting. The Pacific Northwest, appearing only briefly in background lore. Texas, vast and historically significant, has been visited only in the tabletop game. New Orleans, a city with the kind of distinctive cultural identity that the Fallout games have consistently used to their advantage. Denver, mentioned in the background lore as Ronto, collapsed, wild dog infected, abandoned. Chicago, the city of the Midwest chapter that has been referenced since the very first game and never visited. Each potential setting carries different implications for what stories can be told within it. A Texas setting might engage with the resource extraction politics that drove the pre-war world more directly than any previous entry, given that petroleum infrastructure would be a primary resource conflict. A New Orleans setting might do more than any previous game with the environmental writing that Fallout has always been capable of, given the city's specific cultural history and its relationship with water and loss and persistence. A Midwest setting, finally delivering on more than 2 decades of implied promises, would allow an exploration of what the heartland of America looks like under the same pressures that the games have previously applied to the coasts. The franchise also has pending conversations to have with itself about the timeline and what the Amazon show has done to it. The most significant unresolved question is the NCR. If Shady Sands was nuked in 2277 and the NCR is effectively destroyed, what does that mean for Fallout? New Vegas, set in 2281, where the NCR is a fully functional military and political force deploying tens of thousands of troops. Either the show's timeline requires reconciliation, or the NCR's collapse and subsequent recovery is a story that needs to be told, or the franchise's commitment to canonical consistency is less absolute than some of its fan base assumes. That last possibility is the one the franchise's historical relationship with its own canon suggests is most likely. Fallout has never been a universe with tight canonical control. Bethesda acquired the franchise from Interplay with games that had introduced contradictions and retcons in their second and third entries. Bethesda's own games have made choices that Black Isle's original development team might not endorse. The franchise has always been more interested in the emotional and thematic territory of its ideas than in maintaining a legally precise timeline that admits no internal discrepancies. This is probably the right approach for the material. The Fallout universe is large enough that demanding total canonical consistency would require sacrificing the creative freedom that produces its best work. The games that have been most beloved are the ones that committed most fully to their own vision within the established framework, not the ones that were most rigorously consistent with everything that preceded them. Fallout New Vegas is the canonical example a game made by many of the people who made Fallout 1 and 2, deeply respectful of the lore they established, and creative enough within that framework to produce something that many players consider the franchise's highest achievement. Fallout 76's evolution is instructive about where the franchise might go with multiplayer elements in future entries. The game launched as an experiment in whether the Fallout experience worked without human NPCs, relying entirely on environmental storytelling and player interaction. The answer was no, not for most players. And Wastelanders, the major content update that added human NPC populations to Appalachia, was the game's turning point. What the game discovered, somewhat painfully, is that the Fallout universe's emotional resonance is inseparable from the human stories it tells through its characters. You can make a technically functional multiplayer survival game in the Fallout setting. You cannot make a game that feels like Fallout without the human element. The franchise's relationship with mortality is one of the things a future entry will need to think through carefully, especially in the light of the show's expanded timeline. Cooper Howard is 219 years old. The Vault Dweller was already elderly before they left Arroyo for the last time. These characters' longevity is not presented as uncomplicated blessing, it involves losses no ordinary human lifespan produces. Relationships with time and loss that require new psychological frameworks. A future Fallout game could engage with this more directly. A protagonist who is not at the beginning of their post-war journey but somewhere in its middle, who already has the weight of years of the wasteland behind them, who knows what they know because they have already paid the cost of learning it. The alternative to a long-lived protagonist is the option the games have mostly chosen. A protagonist who is specifically new to the surface, who carries the disorientation of the vault, or some equivalent enclosed system, who learns alongside the player. This works because it maintains the discovery experience that makes Fallout's world-building so effective. You find things out because your character is finding things out. The environmental storytelling lands with full force because nothing has been pre-explained. Somewhere between these options is the most interesting possibility. A protagonist with history, with prior experience of the wasteland, whose knowledge of the setting is already present but whose understanding of a specific region or situation begins where the player's does. The courier in New Vegas already gestured at this someone who has clearly been operating in the wasteland for years before the game begins, whose competence is established rather than being built from scratch, and it worked. Future entries could go further in this direction, giving players the worldview of someone who has been living in it long enough to see how the patterns work. What Fallout will almost certainly not do, in any future entry, is resolve the fundamental tension at the heart of its universe. That tension is between the genuine horror of what happened, the bombs, the experiments, the death of the world that was, and the genuine possibility embedded in what followed. People built communities. People found meaning. People fell in love and raised children in the ruins and figured out how to grow food in irradiated soil and made art on the walls of structures that used to be something else. The wasteland is genuinely beautiful in the way that Fallout renders it, genuinely alive in the way its ecosystems have adapted and continued, genuinely full of human beings doing the irreducible human things that people do even under the worst conditions. This is Fallout's central argument, the one that every game and the show are all making in different registers, that the world ended and the world did not end, that both of these things are true simultaneously, that the people in the ruins are living real lives, and not simply performing the afterthought of lives that ended with the bombs. The world the Great War destroyed was not the only possible world. The world that grew in the aftermath, strange, dangerous, deeply damaged, full of wonder and horror, and all the ordinary human texture that neither wonder nor horror can entirely displace, is real. The franchise continues because that argument continues to be interesting, continues to be worth making, continues to illuminate something true about how human beings respond to catastrophe that does not diminish with repetition, but deepens with each new angle of approach. Each new game, each new entry in the show is another way of saying, this is what we are, not what we were, not what we might have been. What we are, in the ruins of the thing we built and could not stop destroying, making something out of the pieces, and that somehow, against all reasonable expectation, is enough. Deeper lore. The Great War counting down to October 23rd. The day the bombs fell was a Tuesday. The 23rd of October 2077, in the fiction of Fallout, is the axis on which everything turns. Before it, there was the world as it was. After it, there was everything the games have ever shown you. But to understand what October 23rd means, you have to understand what the preceding decades looked like. And the picture that emerges from the accumulated lore across the entire series is one of extraordinary and careful inevitability. The resource wars began in 2052, when the United Nations attempted to broker peace between European nations fighting over the last viable petroleum deposits in the Middle East. The attempt failed. The European members walked out. The UN, unable to fulfill its fundamental function of preventing member states from going to war with each other, dissolved in 2052 as well. The institution that had been the framework for international order since 1945 simply stopped existing, and what replaced it was the direct, unmediated confrontation of national interest. America's involvement escalated in phases. The annexation of Canada in 2076, a move that the Fallout games refer to consistently enough to indicate that it was a central event in the pre-war political landscape, was not a sudden decision, but the endpoint of a long process of economic and military integration that gradually eliminated whatever meaningful distinction had existed between the two countries. Canada's resources, particularly its oil sands, were too valuable to the American war machine to allow them to remain outside direct American control when the resource situation was critical enough. The Sino-American War grew from the same root. China needed Alaskan oil. America needed Alaskan oil. The two countries went to war over it, a war that began in 2066 when Chinese forces invaded Alaska. Operation Anchorage, the campaign to retake Alaska, lasted until 2077, and is the setting of the Fallout 3 DLC that allows the lone wanderer to re-experience it through a military simulation. The campaign is presented in the DLC as a genuine military achievement, which it was, but the tone, the propaganda poster aesthetic, the simulation's gamification of actual combat, carries the game's characteristic ironic awareness of the gap between how America told the story of its wars and what those wars actually were. The domestic situation in pre-war America was under maximum pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The resource shortage drove fuel costs to extraordinary heights. Electric vehicles became the default form of transportation. Cities had air quality monitors at every major intersection. The food supply was under strain from environmental degradation. Corporations that had been operating with limited oversight for decades were now fully integrated with the government in ways that blurred the distinction between public policy and private interest to the point of invisibility. The Vault-Tec government contract was the extreme expression of this integration, but it was not an anomaly. It was the character of the whole arrangement made legible. The social contract in this environment was under strain that the official culture of the period did not acknowledge. The Fallout universe's retro-futurism, the atom-powered cars, the robots, the Technicolor advertisements is the surface of a society that used aesthetic confidence to paper over structural failure. The ads tell you everything is fine. The ads tell you that the future is bright and the products are good and the American way of life is succeeding. And under the ads, the draft riots, the union busting, the resource lines getting shorter, Nuka-Cola's market dominance in the pre-war period is a detail that does more world-building work than it might appear to. By the 2070s, Nuka-Cola had effectively eliminated its major competition and achieved something close to a monopoly on the American soft drink market. The Nuka-Cola Corporation was large enough and integrated enough with the political and economic system that even the regulators who were supposed to limit monopoly power had been captured by the industry they were supposed to regulate. The Nuka Quantum variant, which contained small amounts of radioactive material as part of its blue coloration chemistry, was approved for sale with minimal regulatory review. The approval was procedurally valid. The process that produced it was entirely corrupted. This is the texture of pre-war America in the Fallout universe, and it is deliberately recognizable. The exaggeration is present, but it is calibrated. Every element has real antecedents in the actual history of the 20th century, pushed slightly further in the direction each trend was already heading. The point is not to produce a fantasy of historical evil, but to trace the actual lines of how things go wrong, slowly, through accretion of small failures and compromised decisions and institutional captures that each seem manageable at the time and are collectively catastrophic. The bombs themselves were, in the immediate technical sense, a military decision. The missiles launched. The sequence was triggered by someone, somewhere, deciding that the calculation had finally tilted enough to justify first use. The Fallout show suggests that the calculation was tilted deliberately by Vault-Tec, that the bomb's timing was not simply the endpoint of escalating tension, but was accelerated by actors who had already positioned themselves for the aftermath. Whether this is presented as confirmed fact or as a theory that the show's protagonists believe, it is the most politically extreme reading of pre-war Fallout lore, and it fits within the universe's established worldview without contradicting it. On the 23rd of October 2077, the siren sounded at approximately 9:42 in the morning. People in the streets stopped and looked at each other. Vault-Tech's emergency alert system went active, directing vault holders to report to their assigned facilities immediately. The queue outside Vault 101 in the Capital Wasteland, visible in the opening of Fallout 3, shows what this looked like. Families running, carrying what they could grab, officials attempting to manage crowd movement, the desperate arithmetic of more people than spaces. James and Catherine Morrison made it inside. The people behind them did not. The door closed. The bombs hit. In Sanctuary Hills, the neighborhood where Fallout 4 begins, the evacuation time was approximately 2 minutes and 17 seconds from the alert to the detonation, visible on the horizon. The sole survivor and their family made it to Vault 111. The neighbors who were still running when the cryopods sealed are the ash piles visible in the first moments of emerging 200 years later. The specific shape of people caught by the thermal pulse at the moment of detonation, reduced to shadows burned into the surfaces they were nearest when the light arrived. The immediate aftermath, in the first hours and days after October 23rd, is territory the games have barely touched, and that represents one of the most significant unexplored lore spaces in the franchise. The people who were not in vaults, who were not immediately killed, who survived the initial detonations and found themselves in a world that had just stopped being the world they understood what happened to them. The games begin decades after the fact. The eyewitness accounts that survive are fragments, terminal logs, diary entries, bones with context. The years between October 23rd and the game's present are implied rather than shown. What the accumulated evidence suggests is a period of almost unimaginable chaos, violence, starvation, and disease, followed by a slow crystallization of the social structures that the games eventually present. Raider groups, merchant caravans, the first Brahmin-based farming operations, the emergence of something like settlements and the leaders who organized them. The Brotherhood of Steel's exodus from Mariposa to Lost Hills, occurring in the months after October 23rd, was one of the first large-scale organized movements of the post-war period. The ghouls emerging from the areas of heaviest fallout were among the first novel post-war human types the surviving unirradiated population encountered. The super mutant program at Mariposa began producing its first results within months. The world remade itself faster than you might expect, because the alternative to remaking it was simply dying, and enough people chose not to die to create the critical mass that the remade world required. This is not a comfortable observation. The remade world is not comfortable. It is brutal and short-lived and full of horror. But it is also full of people, living lives that are recognizably lives, making choices and forming relationships and building institutions, even when the institutions are crude and the relationships are complicated by the extreme conditions of the environment in which they are formed. The speed of the world's reconstitution is one of the things that makes Fallout's universe more hopeful at the deepest structural level than its surface often appears. The bombs fell and people started building the next thing before the fallout had even settled. The raiders and the traders and the first vault communities opening cautiously to the surface, all of this happened because the will to continue turned out to be stronger than the scale of the disaster. Not for everyone, not without enormous cost, but for enough people to matter. 2 centuries later, the Fallout games find this process still ongoing. Not finished, not healed, but continuous. The wasteland is not the end of something. It is the difficult, violent, remarkable middle of something. That something does not have a name yet. It is being named, right now, in the settlements and trading routes and political arguments and love stories and betrayals and heroic choices of the people who live in it. Deeper lore. The forced evolutionary virus, what FEV actually does. Before the Fallout universe had super mutants, it had a question. What happens to human beings when you subject them to the kind of selective pressure that we apply to other organisms, just faster? What is the difference between natural evolution, which operates across generations, and engineered evolution, which operates across individual bodies? And if you could accelerate the process dramatically, if you could force a change that took millions of years in nature into a single biological transformation, what would you get? West Tech Research Incorporated was contracted by the United States government in 2073 to begin what was designated the New Plague Eradication Program. The West Tech facility in California housed the early research. What the scientists developed over the following years was not a plague treatment, but something far more fundamental, a retroviral agent capable of rewriting the human genome in a living organism. The official designation was the forced evolutionary virus. The name was as precise as it was alarming. The virus forced evolution. It overwrote the genetic instructions in a living organism's cells with a different set of instructions, expressing whatever traits the research team had designed into the viral payload. The potential applications were extraordinary: disease resistance, enhanced strength and endurance, extended lifespan, improved cognitive function. The virus was, in theory, the most powerful medical technology ever developed. The practical applications were tested at Mariposa Military Base, and the practical applications were atrocity. The test subjects were prisoners, not volunteers. The early iterations of the FEV produced mutations that were neither controlled nor beneficial. The virus's interactions with the human genome were more complex than the controlled laboratory environment had suggested, producing unexpected effects alongside the designed ones, including the massive physical alterations that became the defining characteristic of super mutants. The test subjects grew. The cognitive effects were variable. Some retained intelligence, some lost it, none retained it fully in the way that baseline human intelligence operates. The full picture of what FEV does depends on the baseline of the recipient. Organisms without significant radiation-induced mutation are transformed into super mutants, enlarged, strengthened, immunized against disease, rendered sterile. Organisms with significant radiation exposure, the irradiated population of the post-war wasteland, are transformed into what the master scientists called centaurs and floaters, less stable mutations that reflect the interaction of the viral payload with an already altered genome. Ghouls, whose mutation is the result of radiation rather than FEV, occupy a different category that the FEV affects differently. Harold, who fell into the vat alongside Richard Gray, underwent partial ghoulification rather than full super mutant transformation. His long-term contact with FEV produced the tree that eventually grew from his skull and the other distinguishing features of his appearance, not the physical enlargement that characterizes super mutants. The FEV's interaction with already mutated human biology is unpredictable in exactly the ways that make it dangerous. The Institute used FEV differently and more carefully, building it into the genetic foundation of third-generation synth construction rather than applying it directly to living humans. The controlled environment of the Institute's laboratories allowed more precise work than Mariposa's crude immersion vats, and the results, fully biological synthetic humans indistinguishable from natural-born people, represent the virus's application closest to its original potential. But the Institute's use still carries the fundamental ethical problem. The technology is being applied to beings who cannot consent to it, to produce beings who did not ask to exist and whose existence serves the purposes of their creators. The FEV-based supermutants of the Capital Wasteland in Fallout 3 are distinct from the California supermutants in one important respect. They were created by the Institute using the FEV samples that Dr. Stanislaus Braun had preserved and that Vault 87 was designed to study. The Capital supermutants are more uniformly reduced in cognitive function than the Mariposa supermutants, possibly because the Vault 87 program prioritized physical capability over cognitive preservation, possibly because of differences in the specific FEV strains used. Fox, the super mutant companion in Fallout 3, is the exception that makes the rule visible. He retained full cognitive function, acquired an extensive library of reading across his years in Vault 87's isolation cell, and developed a philosophical framework for his own situation that the game presents with genuine respect. His intelligence is not a glitch. It is the evidence that the FEV does not uniformly destroy cognition, but rather interferes with it in ways that depend on variables the original research barely understood. The conditions under which Fox was exposed, the specific moment in his pre-mutation development, some interaction between his individual baseline genetics and the virus's payload, something produced a different result in him than in the thousands of other individuals who went through the same process. Marcus in Fallout 2 and New Vegas is the other major super mutant character whose cognitive preservation the games used to complicate the narrative. He was a first-generation Mariposa super mutant who fought in the Master's army, survived the army's defeat, made peace with his own situation, and became a figure of authority in the post-Master wasteland. He is thoughtful, patient, wry in a way that only becomes possible when you have had long enough to develop a sense of humor about your own absurdity. He has thought more carefully about what the super mutants are, what their existence means, what their future looks like, whether their future is in cooperation with the human wastelanders or in conflict than most of the humans in his vicinity. The question Marcus keeps returning to is the one that haunts the FEV's entire history. What did we become, and what does that entitle us to, and what does it require of us? The Master's answer was that the transformation entitled the super mutants to inherit the Earth, to replace the damaged and self-destructive baseline human population with something stronger. Marcus's answer is more modest and more interesting, that the transformation makes super mutants what they are, not what they were, and that what they are has to find its own relationship with the world as it exists, rather than claiming authority over it. The FEV never stops being present in the Fallout universe because the knowledge of how to use it never goes away. The Institute has it, the Enclave had it. Somewhere in the accumulated research of the pre-war period, the detailed documentation of what Westtech discovered is preserved on military servers and in hidden caches and in the memories of the handful of surviving researchers and their successors. The virus is the most dangerous piece of pre-war technology still circulating in the wasteland. Not because it kills, though it does, but because it can be used to transform, and the transformation is irreversible, and the people who want to use it are always convinced that this time the application will be controlled. It never is. That is the consistent lesson. Every application of the FEV, across every Fallout game, has produced consequences that the users did not intend, could not fully predict, and could not reverse. The Master did not intend to create an army that would collapse when he learned of its sterility. The Enclave did not intend for the Chosen One to reach the oil rig. The Institute did not intend to produce synths capable of sustained motivation toward escape. The FEV creates things that exceed the expectations of the people who use it, every single time, without exception. This is not because the FEV is magical. It is because the complexity of biological systems exceeds the capacity of any controlled experimental environment to fully model. The FEV does what it does. And what it does is interact with systems of extraordinary complexity in ways that cannot be fully predicted from first principles. Every researcher who has ever worked with it has believed in the specific way that researchers believe things about the systems they have mastered, that they understand it well enough to control it. Every researcher has been wrong in ways that cost other people more than they cost the researchers. Deeper lore. Mr. House and the question of benevolent autocracy. The political philosophy conversation that Fallout New Vegas is most interested in conducting is the one about authority specifically, whether authority that produces good outcomes is legitimate regardless of how it acquired or maintains its power. Robert House forces this question more directly than any other character in the series because he is the faction leader whose case for his own authority is strongest and whose methods are most openly anti-democratic. House does not pretend to be a democratic actor. He does not hold elections. He does not consult the people his decisions affect. He decides, and the Securitrons enforce, and the arrangement is clear about what it is. What he offers in exchange is competence, vision, and the genuine possibility that New Vegas under his management will produce a future that the alternatives cannot. His argument, when he makes it in the Lucky 38's penthouse, is essentially technocratic. The problems facing the Mojave require expertise that democratic processes are structurally unable to efficiently deploy, and the cost of inefficiency, given the stakes, is higher than the cost of autocracy. The case against House is not that he is cruel. He is, within the logic of his position, actually relatively restrained in his use of force compared to the Legion, and comparable in that respect to the NCR. The case against House is that his 260-year lifespan and his genuine brilliance and his absolute certainty about his own conclusions make him the most sophisticated embodiment in the series of the idea that some people are qualified to make decisions for others. The idea is wrong. It is wrong not because capable people do not exist, but because the structural condition of being unchallenged for 2.5 centuries is not compatible with continued accurate modeling of what people need and what the world requires. House has been right about the large things. He predicted the war. He saved Las Vegas. He built the infrastructure that makes the Strip possible. His track record is genuinely extraordinary. What his track record does not address is the question of what happens when he is wrong, which he will eventually be, because everyone eventually is. Under democratic systems, the consequences of leaders being wrong are managed imperfectly, with enormous friction, but managed by the capacity of the governed to remove the governing. Under House's system, there is no mechanism for this. He is wrong when he is wrong, and there is nothing to do about it. The Courier, taking New Vegas for themselves in the Yes Man ending, inherits this exact problem. Yes Man explicitly flags it. The capacity for self-governance that the independent New Vegas will require is not automatically present in a society that has been managed by House. The skills, the institutions, the habits of civic participation that make self-governance functional do not emerge spontaneously in the absence of the prior authority. They have to be built. The Yes Man ending puts the Courier in the position of building them, which is a harder task than winning the battle at Hoover Dam, and one the game is honest enough to acknowledge is not guaranteed to succeed. The NCR, for all its flaws, has already done this building. That is what makes it the most politically interesting faction in New Vegas, despite not being the most dramatically compelling. 200 years of building democratic institutions in a post-apocalyptic environment, making all the compromises that building entails, accumulating all the corruption and bureaucratic dysfunction that complex institutions accumulate. The NCR is the result of someone actually doing the hard work of governance, rather than winning the tactical question of who holds the checkpoints. Its expansionism and its internal problems are the problems of a real government, rather than the problems of a military faction or a technocratic authority. Real governments are messier than either of those alternatives. The mess is evidence that the thing is real. Caesar understands the NCR better than he lets his troops know. His historical analysis of the Republic is genuinely incisive, not just self-serving propaganda. He knows that the NCR's extended supply lines, its political battles at home, its difficulty maintaining discipline across a large, diverse population are genuine vulnerabilities. He also knows, and this is the thing his rhetoric conceals, that the NCR has something the Legion does not: the capacity to reproduce itself across generations of people who did not originate in conquest. The NCR can lose battles and recover. The Legion's social model does not generate the kind of internal cohesion that survives the death of the figure around whom it is organized. Caesar knows this. He has planned for this, to the extent that his condition allows him to plan for anything. The plan is not adequate. He probably knows that too. New Vegas's political landscape is the fullest expression of what Fallout has always been interested in at the level of political philosophy: the observation that every system of organizing human beings under conditions of scarcity and danger involves trade-offs that no single option makes disappear. The NCR's democracy is real, and it is corrupt, and it is expansionist. The Legion's order is real, and it is built on slavery and gendered violence. House's competence is real, and it is unaccountable, and it is finite. The independent option is real, and it is undefined, and it is the Courier's responsibility to make it something other than just the absence of the alternatives. The game does not tell you which choice is right. It tells you what each choice is, as honestly as it can, and it lets you choose, and then it shows you briefly what followed. Not definitively, because the future is not definitive, but enough to ask whether what you wanted to achieve by choosing what you chose is actually what happened. Whether the map matched the territory. Whether the theory survived contact with the reality it was meant to predict. That is the exercise Fallout New Vegas is conducting with its player, not a morality play with a correct answer. A political philosophy seminar with no assigned readings and a final exam that consists entirely of choices you have already made. Deeper. Lore. The Boneyard and the City of Angels. Los Angeles was called the Boneyard when the Vault Dweller first walked into its ruins in 1997's Fallout, and the name was earned. 2 centuries after the bombs, what had been the largest city on the American West Coast was a collection of ruins, rubble fields, isolated communities building whatever partial order they could manage inside the larger chaos, and the presence always felt, sometimes directly confronted, of the Master's super mutant army slowly consolidating its control over the surrounding region. The Boneyard's communities have aged into the specific shape that 2 centuries of isolation and conflict produce: pragmatic, defensive, suspicious of strangers in proportion to how much damage strangers have historically done to them, capable of extraordinary generosity and loyalty within their established networks, and capable of extraordinary violence toward anyone outside those networks. This is not a moral judgment on the communities. It is an accurate description of what the conditions of post-war Southern California made of people over 2 centuries. The Hub, the Fallout universe's first major commercial city, sits inland, north, and east of the Boneyard proper. It is a functioning economy. Trade caravans come from the Boneyard, from the north, from the east, carrying goods and information, and the relationships that make trade networks function. The Hub's water merchants control access to the most critical resource in the environment. The power that water control creates in a world where the water tables have been compromised by fallout is total in ways that other forms of resource control are not, because you cannot substitute something else for water. Necropolis, the Ghoul City, sits north of the Hub, the community that grew from Vault 12's deliberate non-sealing. The Set who rules it by the time the Vault Dweller arrives inherited his position through a combination of force and the simple fact that he had been there longer than anyone who might challenge him. He is not beloved. He is not even particularly effective as a leader. He is present, and he is still functional, which, in Necropolis, passes for authority. His relationship with the Vault Dweller is the most direct engagement in the original game, with the question of what ghouls carry and what they have become, and Set's version of the answer is not enough and too much. The cathedral in Los Angeles, the children of the cathedral's central hub, built over the entrance to the Master's Vault, is the religious and military face of the Unity's public-facing operation. The Master used the children as an intelligence and recruitment operation. The cathedral's priests gathered information about communities throughout the region, identified candidates for the VATS, managed public perception of the spreading super-mutant threat in ways that slowed organized opposition. The cathedral was a successful piece of operational design. The children believed in what they were told they believed in. Their faith was genuine if its doctrinal foundation was constructed by someone using it as a tool. The moment the Master dies, in the levels below the cathedral, the super-mutant army above ground goes into chaos. Command structures collapse when the unified consciousness coordinating them fragments. Some super-mutants revert to the instinctual violence that the Unity's military discipline had been suppressing. Others scatter. The organized military threat that the game has been building as its central dramatic pressure dissolves faster than it took to create it. This is a consistent lesson in the Fallout universe. The large threats are more fragile than they appear because they are organized around individuals or ideologies that can be destroyed, and the destruction of the organizing principle leaves the threat without the coherence that made it dangerous. What remains in the Boneyard after the cathedral's destruction and the army's disintegration is a set of communities that have been living under threat and now have to figure out what living without immediate existential threat looks like. This is not obviously easier than living with it. The threat organized certain social priorities. The coalition building against the super-mutants, the resource sharing, the provisional alliances, these things were held together by external pressure. When the pressure lifts, the internal tensions that the pressure was suppressing find room to operate again. The Boneyard's communities, a decade after the events of the first game, are where the Fallout 2 background tells you they are. Continuing, imperfect, recognizably human enterprises, building on what they had with the tools available to them, neither redeemed by the removal of the threat nor destroyed by its absence. The real work of building something sustainable turns out to be harder and longer than the dramatic moment of defeating the thing that was threatening to end everything. This is true in the Fallout universe, and it is true everywhere else. The moment of crisis is followed by the long, undramatic, essential work of building what the crisis threatened. The Fallout games take you through the crisis. The world between games, visible in the background and the memories of the characters you encounter, is where the undramatic building happens. It is less compelling as narrative material because it lacks the shape of crisis. It is more important, as a practical matter, than anything the protagonist does during the game's events. Deeper lore, caps, commerce, and the economics of the wasteland. The choice of bottle caps as the primary currency of Fallout's wasteland is one of the series' most visually distinctive world-building decisions, And the reasons it works as a currency in the fiction are more interesting than they might initially appear. Currency works when people agree that it works, and the agreement is sustained by confidence in the currency's scarcity, its durability, and its portability. Pre-war money fails these tests immediately. The issuing authority no longer exists, the printing presses are either destroyed or in the hands of people who would simply create inflation, and everyone knows that paper currency backed by a destroyed government is backed by nothing. Caps pass the practical tests. They are durable, metal does not degrade in the way paper does. They are portable, small and light, easily carried in quantity. They are relatively scarce. The production infrastructure for sealed bottle caps was entirely pre-war, meaning new caps can only be produced by finding and cleaning old ones rather than by manufacturing new supply. And they are universally recognizable. The iconic Nuka-Cola and Sunset Sarsaparilla caps are everywhere in the wasteland, carried to every corner of North America by the pre-war distribution network that seeded them throughout the country. The hub's water merchants established caps as the dominant trade currency in the Western wasteland as part of an explicit decision. The choice of caps over other possible currencies reflects the hub's influence over regional trade and the institutional backing. That influence provides. When the hub's traders accepted caps, other traders accepted caps, and the network effect created stability. By the time of the games, the stability is simply assumed rather than maintained by any conscious institutional decision. Caps are money because caps are money, which is the most stable possible foundation for a currency. The NCR attempted to replace caps with its own paper currency, backed by gold reserves at Fort Knox, and the currency worked within the Republic's borders for a while. The problem was that Fort Knox was raided, and the gold reserves were largely stolen by the Legion, undermining the backing that gave the paper currency its value. NCR dollars in New Vegas are worth significantly less than caps, are not accepted by merchants outside NCR territory, and are viewed with the specific skepticism that people in unstable environments apply to anything that requires institutional trust. The Legion, for its part, uses silver and gold coins minted from looted reserves currency, backed by the metal itself rather than by institutional confidence, which is the approach that makes sense for an organization that cannot provide the institutional stability paper currency requires. The caps economy is one of the ways the Fallout universe demonstrates what actually matters when civilizational infrastructure collapses. The things that retain value are the things that have intrinsic utility: food, clean water, medical supplies, ammunition, tools, and the things that serve the basic functions of currency, regardless of institutional backing. The thing that loses value immediately is everything that depended on the institutional infrastructure for its value: stocks, bonds, paper currency, real estate titles, corporate equity. A pre-war deed to property in downtown Boston is worthless in the Commonwealth. The property itself, if it still exists in usable form, has value. The piece of paper saying you owned it is kindling. This dynamic is present in the games primarily as Flavor the Caps economy is never the focus of a major questline, but it is one of the more quietly accurate things the series does about the economics of collapse. Real historical collapses have produced the same pattern. Fiat currency becomes worthless faster than almost anything else. Commodity money reasserts itself. Trade networks rebuild around physical objects with intrinsic utility, and the accumulated financial wealth of the previous system evaporates, while the accumulated physical resources remain. The wasteland merchants who carry their stock in Brahmin-pulled caravans, moving between settlements along routes that the caravans themselves help maintain, are practicing a form of commerce that predates written currency by thousands of years. They know what they have, they know what they need, and they know what other people have and need. And the exchange is the fundamental transaction of trade. I have this, you have that. Let's find the number of caps at which both of us are better off. Everything about the game's economy that feels exotic and post-apocalyptic is running on mechanisms older than civilization itself. The Pip-Boy's built-in barter interface, calculating the value of exchanges in real time, is the game's concession to practicality in a real wasteland barter economy. Every trade would involve extended negotiation, reading of the other person's needs and leverage, careful assessment of what each party actually wants from the exchange. The Pip-Boy compresses this into a menu. But the underlying transaction it is simplifying is the same transaction that humans have been making with each other since before language made negotiation possible. Deeper lore. Appalachia and the stories Fallout 76 tells. Appalachia, the setting of Fallout 76, is often treated as the franchise's outlier, the one that arrived differently and under different circumstances, and carries a different relationship to the series' established patterns. That framing is partially accurate and partially a failure to engage with what the game is actually doing with its setting and its unusual relationship to Fallout's conventions. The decision to set Fallout 76 in West Virginia before any of the major factions of the other games existed was simultaneously limiting and freeing. Limiting because the recognizable political landscape, NCR, Brotherhood, Institute, Enclave, was not present at launch, leaving a setting that felt emptier than the wasteland usually is. Freeing because the absence of those established power structures meant the game could tell stories about what existed before them, about the raw material of the post-war world before it had been organized into the factions that the other games take as given. The Scorched Plague, the game's initial threat, is interesting as a device because it solves a particular Fallout problem. The games need enemies in large quantities for player engagement, but the moral sophistication of the series makes it uncomfortable to simply deploy human enemies without consequence. The Scorched are humans infected by a fungal organism carried in Scorchbeast spores, driven to aggression and eventual death, stripped of the autonomy that would make killing them a morally complicated act. They are victims of the plague before they are enemies of the player. This does not make fighting them satisfying in the way that the Master's super mutant army was satisfying to fight the enemies in the original. Fallout are instruments of a coherent ideology that can be defeated, but it solves the problem of human enemies without the moral weight that human enemies normally carry. Wastelanders introduced the human NPC population that the game initially lacked, and with it the social infrastructure that gives Fallout's world its richness. The settlers and the raiders of Wastelanders are not morally complex in the way New Vegas's factions are. They are recognizable archetypes, functional, rather than philosophically interesting. But their presence gives the game's world the inhabited quality that was genuinely missing. People in the ruins behave like people. They have goals, histories, relationships, grudges. The wasteland becomes a place where things happen, rather than a place where things happened. The Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel, the earliest version of the organization visible in any of the games, offers something genuinely valuable for franchise lore. The Brotherhood before it became what it became. Paladin Romani and Scribe Valdez embody a version of the Brotherhood's internal tension that the later games present as already resolved the conflict between the isolationist, technology hoarding wing and the interventionist, community supporting wing. In 76's timeline, that conflict is still live, still being argued, still capable of going either way. The player's choices in the Brotherhood questline influence which way it goes, at least locally, which is the kind of consequence Fallout games give to player agency at their best. The Mothman mythology woven through Fallout 76's Appalachian setting is one of the franchise's most creative pieces of regional world building since New Vegas incorporated actual Mojave Desert history and culture. The Mothman of West Virginia folklore, the real-world cryptid sightings from Point Pleasant in 1966 and 1967, associated in popular culture with the Silver Bridge collapse, becomes in Fallout 76 a genuine supernatural entity, something that exists in the world beyond easy rational explanation, that the cult of the Mothman worships and the Order of the Eternal Flame studies, and that the player encounters in ways that never fully resolve the question of what it is. The Grafton monster, the Flatwoods monster, the Snallygaster Fallout 76 pulled from the specific regional folklore of West Virginia and Appalachia in ways that no previous Fallout game had done with its setting's real-world cultural background. The West Virginia state song that plays in the game's promotional material was not an accident or a joke. It was a genuine attempt to ground the game in the specific cultural identity of its location in a way that makes the Fallout treatment feel like engagement rather than appropriation. Appalachia's geography, the mountain forests, the cranberry bogs' irradiated wetlands, the ash heaps' mining infrastructure, the Savage Divide's peaks gives the game a visual diversity that rewards exploration even when the narrative is thinner than the other Fallout games. The environment itself is doing work that the story sometimes does not. Walking through the New River Gorge area, or finding the Charleston Capitol building, or climbing to the top of a radio tower in the Savage Divide and seeing the rolling forest canopy spread to every horizon, is beautiful in a way that the Fallout series has always been capable of being beautiful when it commits to a location-specific character. The game's most ambitious narrative content, Steel Rain and its sequels, finally gave Appalachia the political complexity that the franchise is built around. The choices available to the player in resolving the conflict between Paladin Ramani and Knight Shin are not simple, and the consequences of those choices are not reversed by subsequent content but are built upon. This is the Fallout promise. Your choices shaped the world you inhabit, and the world remembers. 76 took years to deliver on this promise fully, but it eventually did. Deeper lore. The vaults we never visited. For every vault that the Fallout games allow you to walk through, Vault 11, Vault 77, Vault 101, Vault 111, there are dozens that exist in the lore as descriptions, references, terminal logs in other facilities, second-hand accounts from survivors, and implication. The vaults we never visited are sometimes the most haunting, because what happened in them is defined entirely by what we are told rather than by what we see. Vault 17 was raided by the Master's army around 2,155, its population taken to the vats in the single largest acquisition of DIP subjects the army ever accomplished. The vault's residents became super mutants. The super mutant characters in the original Fallout who remember being human remember Vault 17. The specific horror of Vault 17 is that it appears to have been a genuine control, Vault 1 of the 17 designed to actually function, which means its residents expected to survive, expected to rebuild, expected that the experiment they had participated in was the act of shelter, rather than something that would see them taken from shelter and transformed. Vault 34 is partially explored in Fallout New Vegas through the Boomer's backstory and the reactor quests, but its full history is told in fragments across the game's peripheral content. It was an armory vault, stocked with an enormous quantity of weapons and ammunition, with a population significantly limited in number relative to the available ordnance. The experiment was about what a heavily armed population in an enclosed space does when it is crowded enough and the governance structures begin to fail. The answer was what the available weapons made possible. Most of the population died in the conflicts that followed. The survivors who eventually made it out became the Boomers, carrying the Vault's legacy of distrust and their extraordinary comfort with explosives into Nellis Air Force Base and the specific social arrangements that grew up there. Vault 68 and Vault 69 are a complementary pair that illustrates how carefully the worst of Vault-Tech's experimental designs were engineered for cruelty. Vault 68 contained 1,000 people, 999 of them female, 1 male. Vault 69 contained 1,000 people, 999 of them male, 1 female. What the experiments were studying is not explicitly stated in the lore, but the parameters are self-documenting. The social dynamics produced by extreme gender imbalance in a closed system, with no possibility of exit and no outside intervention, the experiment designed itself by designing its subject population. No terminal logs from either vault have been presented in the games. The parameters are the entire communication. Vault 81 is explored in Fallout 4 and stands as a rare example of a vault whose experiment failed before it could fully begin. The experiment was designed to test cures for disease using live human subjects. The residents would be exposed to engineered pathogens, and the automated systems would test cures against them. The lead scientist, Dr. Olivet, sabotaged the experiment before it could begin, destroying the pathogen delivery systems and leaving the vault with the resources to function normally. Vault 81 in the game's present is consequently one of the more functional and less traumatized vault communities, not untroubled, but not carrying the specific weight of 2 centuries of deliberate harm. The experiment's failure was the population's salvation. Vault 95 was a rehabilitation vault, designed for patients recovering from chem addiction. The experiment? After 5 years of clean living, the vault's automated systems would release a massive supply of jet, the most addictive substance in the Fallout universe, into the common areas. The hypothesis was presumably about whether recovery was permanent, whether 5 years of sobriety would be sufficient to resist a sudden and enormous availability of the substance the patients had previously been dependent on. The answer was no. The vault records, recoverable in Fallout 4, document the collapse. The gunners who now occupy Vault 95 moved in after the fact, the ruins of a population that was designed to fail available as a convenient base of operations. Vault 96 and its unique mole miner population, the implication that the vault was sealed not as a shelter but as a container, the mystery of what Vault 101's extended lockdown was designed to study beyond the obvious self-sufficiency experiment. The vaults that remain partially or wholly unexamined represent the franchise's deepest reserve of unexplored lore territory. Every hint at an unvisited vault is an invitation to imagine what the designers put behind doors they never fully opened. The vault system as a whole is the series' most direct engagement with the question of what institutions do to people over time. Every vault is a controlled environment, producing controlled outcomes, outcomes that the designers intended, or outcomes that resulted from the interaction of the design with the particular human beings who happen to inhabit it. The horror is distributed across both categories. The experiments that produce their intended outcomes are horrifying because someone intended them. The experiments that went differently are horrifying because the difference between what was intended and what happened reveals the gap between what the designers thought they understood about human beings and what human beings actually are. Closing thoughts. Why we return to the wasteland. There is a moment in Fallout 3, accessible fairly early in the game, where you emerge from Vault 101 into the Capital Wasteland for the first time. The cryogenic opening of Fallout 4 is cinematic and carefully designed. The New Vegas intro is visually spectacular, but the emergence from Vault 101 does something specific that the others do not quite replicate. It comes out of a genuinely claustrophobic space, a community you have known through an entire compressed life from birth to 19, and drops you into a ruined world under an open sky, with the sun hitting everything and the ruins of Washington, D.C. visible in the distance. The first time you see it, something happens that is difficult to fully articulate. The world is enormous and damaged and beautiful and terrifying and completely available. There is no wall at the edge of the map for a very long time in any direction. The settlements and dungeons and landmarks are distributed across an area you can approach from any direction in any order. The Enclave is out there, and the Brotherhood is out there, and Rivet City is out there, and the Jefferson Memorial is out there, and none of them know you are coming, and none of them have been waiting for you specifically, and the world will not stop and pause while you figure out what to do next. It is the feeling of consequence, of being actually in something rather than being processed through something. The wasteland does not accommodate you. You accommodate it. The things that are out there regardless of your readiness. The choices you make actually matter in the sense that they cannot be unmade and the world responds to them. The empty ruin of a grocery store contains the evidence of whoever was inside it when it stopped being a functioning grocery store, and that evidence is still there, waiting for whoever happens to walk through the door. Fallout works, has always worked, and will continue to work as long as it does, because this feeling is genuine. The worlds are made carefully enough and inhabited richly enough that the discovery of a new location, a new terminal log, a new character with a new story, carries the quality of genuine surprise. You found this. It was not placed in front of you by the narrative. You were walking and you turned right instead of left, and there it was. The horror and the warmth and the comedy and the tragedy are all real because the world is real enough to support them all simultaneously. Real places contain all of these registers at once. And the Fallout universe is one of the few fictional settings that achieves this consistently across multiple. The Wasteland is a real place in the sense that matters most for fiction. It is a place you can care about, can be moved by, can return to and find new things in on every visit. The bombs fell. The world ended. People kept going. Things grew in the ruins. Something that is neither the world that was destroyed nor a simple continuation of the ruins is slowly, painfully, imperfectly becoming. You walk into it with everything it has given you, and you look around, and you begin. If you made it all the way through this with me tonight, through every vault and every theory and every ghost story, the Wasteland knows how to tell thank you for spending these hours here. If any of this made you see the Wasteland a little differently, or reminded you why you fell in love with it in the first place, drop a comment and let me know which piece of lore hit hardest. Subscribe to QPlays if you haven't already. There is more of this waiting, more worlds, more theories, more of the strange and beautiful and terrible things that games build when they are built with care. Until next time, rest easy. The wasteland will still be there when you wake up. Deeper lore. The New California Republic Democracy in the Dust. The history of the New California Republic is the longest-running political project in the Fallout universe's post-war timeline, and it is the most ambitious one because of what it is actually attempting to do. The NCR is not trying to survive. Plenty of factions manage that. It is trying to rebuild a recognizable form of democratic civilization in an environment that has no functional precedent for it and every structural incentive against it. The founding myth begins with Aradesh and the Vault Dweller in the decade after Fallout 1's events. Aradesh led the survivors of Shady Sands, a settlement the Vault Dweller helped stabilize in the original game, and turned those survivors into the nucleus of something larger. His daughter Tandy took over after him and governed for decades, long enough that by the time of Fallout 2, Tandy had become a near mythological figure in NCR politics, a president whose tenure was so long and so formative that the Republic was shaped around the decisions she made in ways that even she probably did not fully anticipate. The NCR by Fallout. New Vegas in 2281 has a population of approximately 700,000 people, the largest organized polity in the wasteland, larger than any other faction by an enormous margin. It has multiple states, a functioning legislature, elected representatives, a standing army funded by taxation, a system of courts and law, and genuine civil rights protections for its citizens that are, within the Republic's borders, actually enforced. It also has an overextended military, a corrupt civilian government, an agricultural sector dependent on irrigation from water sources. The Legion controls the upstream of, in some areas, and a foreign policy that has a significant imperialist component dressed in the language of civilization bringing. The NCR Mojave situation is where the tension between the Republic's genuine values and its practical behavior is most visible. The NCR needs Hoover Dam's power generation. The NCR wants access to the New Vegas Strip's tax revenue. The NCR's presence in the Mojave has, over years of occupation, produced the pattern that military occupations tend to produce. Communities that initially welcomed the order and safety the presence provided, now experiencing friction with the soldiers whose discipline has deteriorated, the supply lines that require local resources, the local communities would rather allocate differently, the political decisions made in Sacramento that affect the Mojave without adequate representation of Mojave interests. Ambassador Crocker, the NCR's diplomatic representative on the Strip, is a careful study in what institutional loyalty looks like from the inside when the institution has developed problems the individual representative did not create. He is not a bad person. He is a professional doing his job within a system that has drifted far from its founding commitments, managing the gap between what the Republic says it is and what its actual behavior in the Mojave is, making the practical arguments for why this particular compromise was necessary, even when the compromises accumulate into a pattern he cannot honestly be proud of. General Lee Oliver, the military commander, represents the failure mode of the NCR's military approach in the Mojave more directly. The assumption that sufficient force will resolve a situation that is fundamentally political and economic in character, the escalating commitment to a strategy that has not produced the results it was supposed to produce, the resistance to the kind of honest assessment that would require admitting that the initial approach was wrong. He is not a villain. He is a general who has been given a mission that cannot be accomplished by the methods available to him and has responded by requesting more resources rather than questioning the mission. The follower Arcade Ganon's backstory provides an interesting angle on the NCR's history that the game's main narrative does not otherwise develop. He is the son of an Enclave officer, born to a mother who fled the Enclave after the oil rig's destruction, raised in the Followers of the Apocalypse, a humanitarian organization that has consistently tried to maintain independence from the political factions competing for the Mojave. His perspective on the NCR carries the outsider's ability to see what insiders cannot, that the Republic, in the Mojave, is not behaving in a way that distinguishes it meaningfully from the expansionist powers it was founded to be an alternative to. What Arcade cannot resolve, and what the game is honest enough not to resolve for him, is the question of whether the NCR's potential is more important than its current behavior. The Republic could reform. The institutions exist that would allow reform. The elections are real, the press is functional. The civil society has the structural capacity to generate reform movements. Whether this capacity is adequate to overcome the momentum of an institutional culture that has drifted significantly from its founding values is the question that stays open. The NCR is the faction that makes Fallout New Vegas most politically serious because it is the faction that most directly engages with the question of what you do with a democracy that is failing some of its commitments while still being a democracy. The answer the game offers is, you try to fix it. From inside if you can, and from outside if inside is not working. And you accept that fixing it is slower and harder than replacing it with something simpler. And you accept this because the alternatives that are simpler are also worse. Deeper lore. The followers of the apocalypse, surviving without conquering. If the NCR is Fallout's exploration of democratic governance under pressure, the followers of the apocalypse are its exploration of something quieter and possibly more radical. The proposition that the most important thing you can do in a post-apocalyptic wasteland is make sure the people who are suffering have access to the knowledge and material resources they need to survive. The followers do not hold territory. They do not have standing armies or political ambitions or resources beyond what individual donors and salvage operations provide. What they have is expertise, medical knowledge, historical knowledge, engineering knowledge, agricultural knowledge, and the commitment to share that knowledge with anyone who needs it regardless of their political affiliation, their faction membership, or their ability to pay. This sounds simple, and in some sense it is simple. The implementation is complicated by everything that makes the wasteland the wasteland. Operating in disputed territory requires the followers to maintain neutrality among factions that are hostile to each other and suspicious of any party that claims to serve everyone. Providing medical care to raiders and settlers alike, to legionaries and NCR soldiers, is a principled position and a practically dangerous one. The followers have been attacked by factions that interpreted their universalism as the enemy camp's collaboration. The Mormon fort in New Vegas, the followers' main Mojave base, run by the brilliant and complicated Julie Farkas, is the physical expression of what committed humanitarian operation looks like under extreme constraint. They have fewer supplies than they need. They have more patients than they can adequately serve. They are operating without adequate institutional support in an environment that is actively hostile to humanitarian principles. And they continue. The followers' archive, the accumulated knowledge they have been collecting and preserving since their founding, is the organization's most important contribution to the wasteland's long-term prospects. Medical texts, engineering manuals, agricultural guides, historical records, the followers understand that knowledge lost is harder to recover than territory lost, and that the knowledge needed to rebuild civilization is finite and fragile and requires active preservation. The reason the followers appear in multiple games, maintaining their principles across different political landscapes and different crises, is that the franchise is invested in what they represent. The idea that service to people in need is a complete and sufficient political program, that you do not need a vision of who should govern the wasteland to have a useful contribution to make to the people who live in it. The followers are Fallout's most direct expression of a political philosophy that predates politics, the simple, recurrent human understanding that when someone is hurt, you help them, and that this helping is its own justification. Deeper lore. Dogs, companions, and the friends we made along the way. Rex in Fallout. New Vegas is a cyberdog, a dog whose brain has been placed in a mechanical body, who has been serving as King's loyal companion in the King's gang's territory since before the Kings were a gang. His brain is degrading. He is not going to survive without intervention. Finding him a new brain, the appropriate quest involves options ranging from a raider dog's aggressive brain to an old world dog's sharp brain, with its memory of a world before the bombs is one of the more genuinely affecting side quests in the series because of what Rex represents. Continuity of self when the material substrate of self is failing. Dogmeat in Fallout 1 is found in a junkyard, defending the body of his dead human companion, unwilling to leave even after the companion is gone. In Fallout 3, he is found fighting raiders near a red rocket station, a survivor whose history of human loss has not removed his capacity for loyalty. In Fallout 4, he is the first companion, the one that connects the sole survivor to the Commonwealth from the earliest moments of their emergence into it. In each incarnation, Dogmeat is the same thing, the most direct possible expression of the proposition that loyalty is not diminished by catastrophe, that the bond between people and dogs survives the end of everything, that whatever else the wasteland has destroyed, it has not destroyed this. The companion system in Fallout games is the mechanism by which the games do most of their emotional work on the player, and the quality of the companions is the largest single variable in how much a given game succeeds at this. New Vegas's companion roster is the franchise's best, because each companion's story is thematically connected to the game's central questions about survival, time, and what we owe each other. Veronica Santangelo and her relationship with the Brotherhood, Arcade Gannon and his Enclave heritage, Raoul and his centuries of loss, Boone and his grief, Cass and her anger. Each companion is a different answer to the same question. What do you do with the damage? The companion quests, when they exist and when they are well written, are the games asking this question with specificity and care. What do you do with 2 centuries of outliving everyone you love? What do you do with the knowledge that you killed your own wife to prevent worse? What do you do when the organization that gave you purpose is dying and you cannot save it? The answers the companions find, with the player's help, are not always happy. Sometimes the most honest ending for a companion is the ending that acknowledges the damage without pretending it can be undone, that says, you survived, and the survival cost you things, and the things are gone, and you go on anyway, not healed, going on. This is perhaps the most consistent thing the Fallout series communicates across its entries, the thing that makes it feel true even when its content is fantastical. Going on is not the same as being okay. Going on is not a resolution. Going on is just the next step, and then the step after that, and then the step after that. The wasteland takes and takes and takes, and people take back what they can. And what they take back is not everything they lost, but it is something. And something, in the end, is what they have to build with. The companions are there because going alone is possible, but going with someone is better. Because even in a world that has been reduced to ruins, even in an environment of constant scarcity and danger and loss, the presence of another person who knows what you have been through changes the weight of what you are carrying. Not making it lighter exactly, just making it carried by more than one set of hands. That is what the games keep saying. In every companion quest and every late-night campfire conversation and every moment when the game lets you travel through something terrible with someone who understands it alongside you. The world ended. The world continues. You are not doing it alone. Deeper lore. The radio stations and the music the wasteland plays. Three Dog's voice on Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3 is one of the most carefully designed elements of the game's world building, and its contribution to the experience of playing in the capital wasteland is disproportionate to the amount of actual content it comprises. You are spending most of your time in the wasteland exploring ruins and fighting enemies and navigating quests. The radio is there the entire time, and what it does, in the background of all that activity, is give the wasteland a voice. Three Dog has opinions. He comments on what is happening in the region, acknowledges events that the player has caused, argues for principles of decency and mutual aid with the specific urgency of someone broadcasting to an audience he cannot see from a position he has to defend every day against the entropy that wants to pull it down. He is not a neutral broadcaster. He is a person who made a decision to try to matter in whatever way was available to him and who is available to you every time you tune to his frequency. The music on Galaxy News Radio is pre-war music, specifically the 1940s and 1950s American popular music that the Fallout universe uses as its cultural aesthetic anchor. The specific selection of songs, the juxtaposition of their period optimism with the wasteland environment in which they play, is one of the great sustained ironic gestures in game design. Ella Fitzgerald singing about how nice the world is while you walk through the rubble of what the world became. The Andrews sisters being cheerful over a soundtrack that is playing in a ruined supermarket where the cereal boxes have been sitting on the shelves for 200 years. The irony is not cynical, which is the important thing. The songs are genuinely beautiful and the performances are genuinely moving, and hearing them in the wasteland does not make them hollow. It makes them more painful and more beautiful simultaneously. The way beautiful things become more beautiful when they are clearly finite. when the world they came from is demonstrably gone and the music is all that remains. The music survived. Whatever else was destroyed, this survived. The specific woman who sang this song is dust on the other side of an October that happened over 200 years ago, and her voice is still here, playing in the Pip-Boy's speaker while you walk through the ruins of the civilization that produced it. Mr. New Vegas on radio. New Vegas does something different and complementary, where Three Dog is engaged, arguing, personally invested in the outcome of the Wasteland's political situation. Mr. New Vegas is smooth and detached, the professional entertainer whose performance is polished to the point where it is impossible to tell how much of the performance is a person and how much of it is the performance itself. He also plays pre-war music, but the selection skews lounge and Rat Pack, matching the strip's aesthetic of a pre-war entertainment district that survived into the future largely intact and somewhat unreal. The contrast between Three Dog and Mr. New Vegas is the contrast between the game's two major settings, the raw, ruined, politically urgent capital wasteland of Fallout 3, and the glittering, cynical, stylized world of New Vegas where the ruins are mostly somewhere else, and the surface you walk on has been maintained for a specific purpose. Three Dog is shouting into the void. Mr. New Vegas is providing a service. Both are holding something together by broadcasting into an environment where most forms of continuity have been severed. The things they are holding together are different things, and the difference tells you something about the worlds they inhabit. The radio stations in Fallout 76, broadcasting from empty buildings where the human DJs who recorded them died years before the player characters emerged from the vault, add a specific sadness not present in the other entries. The Appalachian Automated Radio is precisely what its name says. Automated, running on a pre-programmed schedule, looping through its content without anyone making choices about what comes next. The broadcasts reference the people who made them in past tense. The music plays and the announcements announce and the signal continues because the transmitter is still drawing power and no one has turned it off. This is the Wasteland's relationship with continuity in its most compressed form. The signal is still there, the content is still playing, the frequency is still navigable, and none of the conditions that produced it still exist. The voice in the speaker is a recorded voice in a world where the person who made the recording is gone, playing to an audience that did not yet exist when the recording was made. The music is still the music. The gap between when it was made and when you hear it has become geological in scale. The gap does not make the music less itself. The Wasteland plays music from before the end, and the end did not erase the music, and you walk through the ruins listening to it, and it is impossible to fully say whether what you feel is grief or gratitude or some specific combination of the two that does not have a name because it is too precisely the emotional result of this particular set of circumstances to have been named before. The world ended and the music kept playing. That seems right. That seems like something to hold on to.